There is a particular kind of silence that haunts the ocean floor. Not the silence of empty spaces, but the silence of forgotten things. Of cities that might have stood where now only fish swim through darkness 400 feet below the surface. Of voices that might have spoken languages we will never hear. Carved warnings on stones now buried under millennia of sediment. Built monuments that currents have worn to shapeless lumps indistinguishable from natural formations. This is not the silence of absence. This is the silence of vanishing. And there is a profound difference between something that never existed and something that existed and was so completely removed that we stand in the ruins without recognizing them as ruins at all. Debating whether there was ever anything here to begin with, the 12,800 years ago, something vanished. Not just ended as in ceased. Vanished as in was removed, deleted from the book of history, so thoroughly that the pages themselves dissolved, and we are left holding only fragments. Myths, whispers of what might have been written there. And the question that emerges from this silence, the question that mainstream archaeology refuses to ask, but that geology and mythology and probability all scream at us to consider is this. What if a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished? Not destroyed. Destroyed is what happened to Pompeii. Buried under volcanic ash, yes, but buried intact, preserved, waiting to be excavated and studied. We know Pompeii existed because the evidence remains. Not conquered. Conquered is what happened to countless kingdoms throughout history. Their cities were burned, their people enslaved, their monuments toppled. But even in defeat, they left ruins, pottery shards, written records that survived in the archives of their conquerors. We know they existed because traces remain. Vanished is different. Vanished is what happens when the mechanisms of disappearance are so thorough, so comprehensive, so geologically and temporally complete that trying to find evidence becomes like trying to find a specific grain of sand that you dropped into the Sahara Desert 3,000 years ago. You know it is there somewhere. Probability says it must still exist in some form. But the search is hopeless because the desert is too vast and the grain is too small and time has shifted the dunes 10,000 times. And what you are looking for is identical to everything else around it. And you do not even know which dune to start with. This is the problem of deep time. This is the problem of catastrophic vanishing. This is the problem that faces anyone who asks whether a sophisticated civilization could have existed during the Ice Age, thrived on the coastal plains that are now 400 feet underwater, achieved knowledge that later civilizations would have to slowly rediscover, and then been so completely removed by fire and flood and time that 12,000 years later we stand on dry land are arguing about whether they existed at all. The conventional answer is no. The paradigm says no. Human civilization began around 3500 BC with the Sumerians in Mesopotamia. Before that, small agricultural villages from about 10,000 BC. Before that, hunter-gatherers, primitive stone age capable only of basic survival. The timeline is clear. The textbooks are written, the consensus is established, and anything suggesting otherwise is dismissed as pseudoscience. As the wishful thinking of people who want ancient aliens or Atlantis to be real, because the mundane truth of gradual human development is not exciting enough. But this dismissal rests on a foundation that has never been properly tested. It assumes that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It assumes that because we have not found evidence of pre-deluge lost civilization, no such civilization existed. But this assumption only holds if we have actually looked in the places where evidence would be with methods capable of finding evidence after 12,000 years of vanishing and found nothing. And we have not done this. We have not looked. We have looked in the wrong places using methods designed to find recent history and finding nothing there. We have concluded nothing existed anywhere. This is not science. This is assumption masquerading as conclusion. Consider what 12,000 years means. Not as an abstract number, but as an actual span of time with actual physical consequences. 12,000 years is approximately 40-80 human generations. If you could line up your ancestors in a room, parent to grandparent to great-grandparent, and so on, you would need to walk past 480 people to reach your ancestor who was alive when the Ancient Deluge occurred. Think about how much detail is lost in the transmission from grandparent to grandchild. How stories become simplified, embellished, forgotten. Now multiply that degradation across 40-80 generations. By generation 10, history becomes legend. By generation 50, legend becomes myth. By generation 100, myth becomes vague story that might not be true. By generation 480, complete amnesia. We remember nothing. Our collective cultural memory reaches back perhaps 200 generations at absolute maximum. And even that is fragmentary, preserved only because it was written down and the writing survived. Anything before writing, anything from more than a few hundred generations ago is gone from memory. If it happened, we have no recollection. We must reconstruct from physical evidence, from archaeology, from what survives in the ground. But what survives 12,000 years? Not wood. Wood rots in a few centuries, maybe a millennium if conditions are dry or frozen or waterlogged in exactly the right anaerobic way. Wood becomes unrecognizable after 12,000 years. Wood is completely gone. Not leather, not textiles, not rope, not paper, not parchment. Not anything organic unless it was preserved immediately in extraordinary conditions that prevented decomposition, and then remained in those conditions uninterrupted for the entire span. Not metal in most forms. Copper and bronze oxidize, they form green patina, they corrode. They eventually crumble into powder and disperse as minerals into the soil. Iron rusts. Iron oxide is indistinguishable from natural iron ore. After 12,000 years, an iron artifact returns to iron ore. You could walk over it with a metal detector and not know it had ever been worked by human hands. Gold survives, yes, but thin objects dissolve. Only large gold pieces might survive in recognizable form, and even those would be scattered, buried. Impossible to distinguish from natural gold nuggets, not ceramics intact. Pottery survives as broken pieces, shards. But after 12,000 years of freeze, they'll cycle, shattering the pieces, smaller chemical weathering, breaking down the clay, eventual return to sediment. Only in protected contexts, buried immediately and never disturbed, would ceramics survive in recognizable form. Not buildings unless they were massive stone, and even then not really. Limestone dissolves in acid rain over thousands of years. Sandstone erodes in wind. Granite, the most durable, weathers at approximately 1 millimeter per 1,000 years. After 12,000 years, the 12 millimeters of surface removed, carvings smoothed away, inscriptions vanished, structures begin to look like natural rock formations. And this is assuming the structures remained on the surface, exposed, weathering slowly. But what actually happens over 12,000 years is burial. Rivers deposit sediment constantly. Coastal areas accumulate meters of sediment per 1,000 years. After 12,000 years, 10 to 100 meters of sediment burial. Anything built on a coastal plain or in a river valley is now buried under that much overburden, completely invisible from the surface. You would need to drill or excavate through all that sediment to even know something was there. And we have not done this systematically. We have drilled for oil and gas and minerals. Yes, but the drillers are not screening the cores for ancient artifacts. They are looking for petroleum reservoirs and ore deposits. If they pulled up a worked stone or a metal fragment, they would not recognize it as significant. It would be noted as rock or mineral, catalogued and discarded or archived without further analysis. And this is in the rare locations where deep drilling has occurred at all. Most of the continental shelves, the coastal plains that were dry land during the Ice Age and are now 400 feet underwater, have never been drilled, have never been systematically surveyed with ground-penetrating sonar capable of detecting buried structures, have never been excavated archaeologically. We have looked at less than 1% of these areas, less than 0.1% in most regions. And based on finding nothing in the tiny fraction we have examined, We conclude with confidence that nothing exists in the vast area we have not examined. This is not logic. This is assumption. But the vanishing was not just burial. It was also violent transformation. 1,200 years ago, the Younger Dryas catastrophe began. Whether triggered by cosmic impacts, as the growing body of evidence suggests, or by other mechanisms, the result was sudden climate reversal, continent-wide fires, megafauna extinction, and human population collapse. If impacts occurred, and the evidence for this is substantial, nanodiamonds and platinum anomalies and shocked quartz and magnetic microspheres found at dozens of sites across North America and Europe, all dated to the same moment, then the immediate effects would have been devastating. Air bursts over the ice sheets would have vaporized billions of tons of ice, releasing massive amounts of water vapor that would fall as torrential rain. Ground impacts would have thrown debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet. The heat from the impacts would have ignited wildfires on a continental scale. We see the evidence of this in the black mat layer, a charcoal-rich sediment found across North America, representing the ash from fires that burned everything. If a civilization existed on the coasts at this time, if they had cities on the plains that are now underwater, those cities would have burned. The wooden structures would have been consumed, the organic materials destroyed. The survivors, if any, would have fled inland away from the fires and the floods and the collapsing climate. And then the sea level rise would have come, not immediately. The Younger Dryas actually slowed sea level rise for a time because the climate was colder and the ice stopped melting. But when the Younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago, the warming resumed and the ice melted catastrophically. Meltwater Pulse 1b released enormous volumes of water in a geologically short period, 30 to 50 feet of sea level rise in 200 to 500 years. Coastlines moving inland at rates visible within a human lifetime. Everything built on the coastal plains would have been progressively flooded, buried under rising waters, and then subjected to 12,000 years of marine erosion and sediment deposition. This is what vanishing looks like. Not a single mechanism, but multiple processes working together. Fire destroying organic materials, flooding burying sites underwater, sediment accumulating on top of the flooded remains, chemical weathering dissolving what the fire did not burn and the water did not bury, geological processes, tectonic shifts, continued sedimentation, erosion of anything exposed, transformation of anything buried. Time, the 12,000 years of time, each year adding another thin layer of forgetting, each century weathering away more of what survived, each millennium compounding the vanishing until what remains, if anything remains at all, is indistinguishable from the natural landscape. Unless you know exactly where to look and exactly what you are looking for, and have the technology and resources to excavate, or scan or analyze with sufficient precision to detect the faint anomalies that might indicate human presence 12,000 years ago. And we do not have this. We do not have systematic surveys of the continental shelves. We do not have comprehensive underwater archaeology programs searching for Ice Age settlements. We do not have deep core sampling of coastal sediment screening for artifacts. We have not looked, and not looking we have found nothing, and finding nothing we have concluded nothing was there. The logic is circular. The paradigm protects itself. The question is never seriously asked, because the paradigm says the answer is already known. But what if the paradigm is wrong? What if the absence of evidence is simply the expected result of 12,000 years of comprehensive vanishing combined with looking in the wrong places? What if sophisticated human cultures did exist during the Ice Age? Concentrated on the coastal plains where resources were abundant and climate was moderate, and access to both land and sea provided everything necessary for civilization to develop. What if they built cities on those plains using wood and stone and possibly bronze, or even iron if the references in ancient texts are preserving actual memories? What if they had knowledge of astronomy and mathematics and agriculture and metallurgy and architecture and all the arts of civilization? And what if the Younger Dryas catastrophe destroyed them so completely that only scattered highland refugees survived, carrying fragments of knowledge that would take thousands of years to reassemble? What if the flood myths are not exaggerated memories of local river floods, but accurate cultural memories of actual planetary catastrophe that destroyed a world? What if Sumer and Egypt and the other early civilizations are not the beginning of human sophistication, but the recovery, the rebuilding, the slow rediscovery of what had been known and lost? What if we are not the first? What if we are just the latest? And what if everything we think we know about human history is wrong? Not because we are stupid or because the evidence is deliberately hidden, but simply because the evidence vanished and we have not yet looked in the right places with the right methods to find the faint traces that might possibly remain. Before we go further, before we examine what this lost civilization might have been like and what evidence they might have left, and why that evidence has not been found, and what it means for us today, take a moment. Hit the like button if you have ever wondered what lies beneath 400 feet of ocean water on the continental shelves that were dry land during the Ice Age. Subscribe because we are going to ask the questions that mainstream archaeology refuses to ask and examine the evidence that conventional history ignores. Comment where you are listening from and whether you believe it is possible that lost civilizations existed before the ones we are taught about in school. Because this is not just an academic question. This is not just an interesting mystery to ponder. This is a question about who we are, where we came from, what happened to those who came before us, and whether the same thing could happen to us. This is a question about cycles and warnings, and whether we are wise enough to learn from the vanished, or arrogant enough to repeat their fate. The stakes are higher than you might think. If no lost civilization existed before the deluge, if the conventional timeline is correct and humans were primitive until the development of agriculture 10,000 years ago and cities 5,000 years ago, then we are unique. We are the first. We are pioneers blazing a trail no one has walked before. And perhaps that means we are also safe in a way previous generations were not, because we have science and technology and understanding that they lacked. But if a lost civilization did exist and vanished, if they had achieved sophistication comparable to Bronze Age or possibly beyond, and were destroyed so completely that we debate their existence, then we are not unique, we are not first, we are not special, we are just the latest in a pattern of rise and fall, a pattern of achievement and vanishing, a pattern of building civilizations that seem permanent until the moment they are destroyed and then are forgotten so completely that future generations question whether they ever existed at all. And if we are part of a pattern, then the pattern could repeat is repeating. We are building the same kind of vulnerable coastal civilization they built. We are concentrating our populations in the same places they concentrated. We are assuming permanence the way they assumed permanence. And we are ignoring the warnings the way they apparently ignored the warnings, if the myths of divine warnings before the deluge preserve any truth at all. The question of whether a lost civilization vanished before the ancient deluge is not just about the past. It is about the future. It is about recognizing that everything we build is temporary. That knowledge can be lost. That sophistication provides no immunity to catastrophe. That 12,000 years from now, if a civilization exists, they might stand on land that is now ocean and debate whether we existed. Whether the stories they have inherited about the ancient world that was destroyed by rising seas and climate chaos are real history or just mythology. They might find scattered anomalies, strange plastic deposits and radioactive isotopes and chemical signatures in the sediment. And they might argue about what these anomalies mean, whether they indicate lost civilization or just natural processes that happen to resemble artificial markers. and mainstream academics in that future civilization might dismiss the possibility that we existed, might say the timeline is clear. Humans were primitive until their own civilization began, and anything suggesting otherwise is pseudoscience. The cycle continues. Rise, achievement, vanishing, forgetting, rise again. Unless we break the cycle, by recognizing it exists, by learning from the vanished, by taking seriously the possibility that they existed and that their fate could be ours, by asking the question that the paradigm forbids, what if? What if a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished? Not destroyed, but vanished. Not conquered, but removed. Not simply lost, but deleted from history so thoroughly that only myths and scattered anomalies and the testimony of catastrophic geology remain to hint that they were ever here at all. This is the impossible question. Impossible not because it is absurd, but because the evidence that would answer it definitively has been destroyed by the very catastrophe we are asking about. We are trying to reconstruct a crime scene after the crime scene has been carpet bombed and then buried under 400 feet of water and then left to decay for 12,000 years. And yet we must ask, we must consider, we must examine what fragments remain. Because if they existed, if a lost world thrived during the Ice Age on the lands that are now ocean floor and vanished by fire and flood and time, then their story is not just their story. It is our warning. It is our preview. It is the mirror held up to show us what we are building and what might be coming, and whether we are wise enough to see the reflection and change course before we become the next civilization that vanishes. The next impossible question that future archaeologists debate while standing on the ruins they do not recognize as ruins, arguing about whether we were ever really here at all. The silence of the ocean floor is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of vanishing. And the question echoes up from the depths 400 feet below the surface, from the places where we have not looked, asking us to remember what we have forgotten, asking us to consider the impossible, asking us whether we are first or latest, asking us whether we will learn or repeat. The deluge was real. The vanishing was comprehensive. And the question remains unanswered, hanging in the silence, waiting for someone brave enough to dive into the depths and search for what was lost. Waiting for us. If we allow ourselves to ask the impossible question, if we set aside the paradigm that forbids inquiry and consider seriously the possibility that a lost civilization existed before the deluge and vanished, the next question follows naturally. What were they like? Not in the sense of speculative fantasy, not imagining them as Atlantean supermen with crystal technology and flying machines, but in the sense of realistic reconstruction based on what we know about human capability, about Ice Age geography, about the resources that would have been available and the constraints that would have shaped their development. What could a sophisticated human culture have achieved 12,000 years ago? Where would they have built? How would they have lived? What technologies might they have mastered? And why would all trace of them have vanished so completely that we stand arguing about whether they existed at all? These are not idle questions. These are questions about probability and evidence, and the uncomfortable realization that the world of 12,000 years ago was profoundly different from the world we see today. And that difference might hide an entire chapter of human history we have never seriously investigated. Begin with geography, because geography is destiny. Where civilizations arise is not random. It is determined by access to resources, by climate, by the availability of water and food and materials for building. And the geography of the Ice Age was utterly unlike the geography we know. This is not abstract. This is concrete, measurable fact. During the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked in ice sheets covering North America and Europe and parts of Asia that global sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. 400 feet. That is the height of a 40-story building. Imagine standing at the current coastline and looking out at the ocean and knowing that if you could walk on water, You would have to walk miles, tens of miles in some places, hundreds of miles in others, before the water depth reached 400 feet, and you finally arrived at what would have been the Ice Age coastline. Everything between here and there, all that continental shelf, now submerged, was dry land, habitable land, and not marginal land, but prime real estate. In Southeast Asia, the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Philippines were not islands. They were connected in a single vast landmass called Sunderland, approximately the size of Australia, with huge river systems and inland seas and coastlines that offered access to both terrestrial and marine resources. This was not jungle wilderness. This was fertile, moderate climate, resource-rich territory. In Europe, Britain was connected to the continent by a land bridge called Doggerland, a landscape of rivers and marshes and rolling plains that extended from what is now the English coast to Denmark and the Netherlands. The North Sea did not exist in its current form. It was a series of freshwater lakes and rivers draining into the Atlantic far to the north. In North America, the Bering Land Bridge connected Alaska to Siberia, allowing migration between continents, and the coastlines extended far beyond their current positions on both the Atlantic and Pacific sides. In the Middle East, the Persian Gulf was completely dry land, a river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates flowed together through what is now underwater and emptied into the ocean far to the south of the current Gulf. And these coastal plains, these continental shelves, were not the frozen tundra we might imagine when we think Ice Age. They were the most desirable places to live. Why? Because proximity to ocean moderates climate. Coastal areas are warmer in winter and cooler in summer than interior continental locations at the same latitude. Ocean provides reliable source of protein through fishing. River mouths and estuaries are among the most biologically productive environments on Earth. Rich in fish and shellfish and waterfowl, coastal plains have access to both marine and terrestrial resources, allowing diverse subsistence strategies. Flat terrain makes building easier. Rivers provide fresh water and transportation routes. This is why today 40% of the global human population lives within 100 kilometers of a coastline. Not because we are foolish, because coasts are optimal. And there is no reason to think Ice Age humans were different. They would have concentrated on coasts just as we do. But their coasts are now 400 feet underwater. Their settlements, if they had settlements, are now on the ocean floor. Their cities, if they had cities, are now buried under 12,000 years of marine sediment. We are looking for evidence of Ice Age civilization in the highlands, in the mountains and interior plateaus, because that is the only land that survived the sea level rise. But highlands during the Ice Age were marginal territories. They were colder, harsher, less productive. The equivalent of searching for evidence of modern human civilization by excavating only the Tibetan Plateau or the Andes Mountains and concluding based on finding sparse remains that humans were primitive and few in number. We are systematically ignoring the places where civilization would actually have concentrated because those places are now inaccessible to conventional archaeology. So if they built on the coasts on the plains that are now submerged, what might they have built? What level of sophistication might they have achieved? We can establish a range from conservative to speculative. And the truth, if it exists, lies somewhere in that range. The conservative estimate would place them at advanced Neolithic level. They would have had sophisticated stone tool technology. The kind of precision stonework we see at like Geo-Beakley Tepe, where 18-foot stone pillars were quarried, transported, erected, and carved with intricate animal reliefs. This requires organization. It requires coordinating hundreds of workers. It requires understanding leverage and engineering principles. It requires surplus food production to support non-food producing specialists like carvers and builders. They would have had agriculture, or at least proto-agriculture, selective cultivation and management of plants, even if not full-scale farming. They would have domesticated animals, or been in the process of domestication. Dogs certainly, possibly others. They would have built boats because coastal people need boats. And the evidence from places like Australia, occupied continuously for at least 50,000 years, proves that Ice Age humans had watercraft capable of crossing significant stretches of ocean. They would have had social hierarchy, leaders and followers, because any group large enough to build megalithic structures has hierarchy. They would have had religion or complex ritual systems, the kind of spiritual worldview that motivates building monuments. They would have had art. We know Ice Age humans had art because the cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira and dozens of other sites, some dating to 30,000 years ago or more, prove they had sophisticated artistic capability. But this conservative estimate may be too conservative because it assumes Ice Age humans were at the beginning of cultural development, primitives just starting to figure things out. But anatomically modern humans existed for 300,000 years before the deluge. Behaviorally modern humans with fully modern brains and language and symbolic thought existed for at least 70,000 years. 12,000 years ago, the humans who might have built an Ice Age civilization were not recently evolved primitives. They were us, genetically identical. Same brain capacity, same intelligence, same creativity. If you took a baby from 12,000 years ago and raised them in modern society, they would be indistinguishable from any other person. So why assume they were incapable of what later humans achieved? Why not assume they were capable of more? The moderate estimate would place them at early Bronze Age equivalent. This means they would have discovered and developed metallurgy not necessarily through the same pathway we see in the Middle East, where copper working appears around 5000 BC and bronze around 300 BC, but through their own experimentation with native copper and tin. Copper can be worked cold, hammered into shape, and it occurs naturally in many regions. Recognizing that heating copper makes it easier to work, and then discovering that mixing copper with tin produces bronze, a harder and more useful alloy. These are not insurmountable intellectual leaps. They require experimentation and observation and transmission of knowledge, but they are well within the capability of people with modern brains. If an Ice Age coastal civilization existed for hundreds or thousands of years, developing cumulatively, why would metallurgy be beyond them? The biblical text in Genesis 4 mentions Tubal-Cain described as an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron and places him before the deluge. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this as anachronism, assuming the text was written later and projected later technology back into mythological prehistory. But what if the text is preserving an actual memory? What if metallurgy did exist before the deluge and was lost and had to be rediscovered afterward? The moderate estimate would also include writing or proto-writing symbols used to keep records, perhaps not full phonetic script, but ideographic or pictographic systems sufficient for accounting and basic communication. It would include long-distance trade networks because coastal civilizations naturally develop trade moving goods by boat more efficiently than overland. It would include urban settlements, not necessarily huge cities, but organized towns of thousands or tens of thousands of people with public buildings and residential areas and specialized districts for crafts. It would include sophisticated architecture, stone foundations, and possibly more durable materials than wood, techniques for quarrying and moving large stones, knowledge of geometry and planning. All of this is plausible. None of this requires technology we know to be impossible with available resources. It simply requires time and cultural development, and time they had. The speculative estimate pushes further, suggesting that if metallurgy existed, why stop at bronze? The references in ancient text to knowledge of iron, to astronomical observations that require long-term systematic sky watching, to mathematical principles that appear fully formed in later civilizations, all suggest the possibility cultures might pre-deluge have achieved even more. The Great Pyramid encodes mathematical constants like pi and phi in its proportions. Standard explanation. The Egyptians of 2600 BC discovered these through their own genius. Alternative explanation. They were applying knowledge inherited from earlier traditions, building on foundations laid before the deluge. The Sumerian-based 60 number system, still used today for time and angles, appears fully developed in the earliest texts. Standard explanation. They invented it. Alternative explanation. They preserved it from earlier mathematical traditions. The knowledge of precession. The 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis appears in various ancient cultures despite requiring centuries of continuous observation to detect. Standard explanation. Independent discovery. Alternative explanation. Inherited from civilization that had observed the sky for millennia. None of this proves lost pre-deluge civilization existed, but it raises the question, why do so many sophisticated concepts appear seemingly complete rather than developing gradually? And the answer might be because they were being recovered and rediscovered from fragments of earlier knowledge rather than invented from scratch. But let us not run away into fantasy. Let us stay grounded in what is actually plausible. A realistic reconstruction of Ice Age coastal civilization would not imagine them as technologically superior to Bronze Age cultures. It would imagine them as equivalent, as building settlements from wood and stone, using boats for fishing and trade, practicing agriculture or advanced foraging, working copper and possibly bronze, creating art and music and religion, organizing themselves into chiefdoms or small kingdoms, passing down knowledge through oral tradition and possibly written or symbolic records, living lives that were not primitive or brutish, but were instead the normal human existence of people with modern intelligence, applying themselves to the challenges and opportunities of their environment. The question is not whether they could have done this. They could have. The question is whether they did. And that question cannot be answered definitively because the evidence that would answer it is now underwater, buried, eroded, transformed, lost to the comprehensive vanishing we examined in Phase 1. Consider population. If sophisticated coastal cultures existed, how many people are we talking about? Global human population at the peak of the Ice Age around 13,000 years ago is estimated by geneticists at approximately 5 to 10 million. This is based on genetic diversity and modeling population growth rates backward from known later populations. If we assume 40% of those people lived on or near coasts, which is the proportion today and has no reason to be different, then that gives us 2 to 4 million people in coastal locations. Not all of them would have been part of organized civilizations. Many would have remained in small bands practicing foraging and fishing. But if even 10% were part of larger organized societies, that is 200,000 to 400,000 people living in settlements of significant size, if distributed across dozens of coastal cities, that gives average populations of 10 to 20,000 per city, comparable to early Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Uruk at their beginnings. These are not massive populations, but they are sufficient for civilization, sufficient for social stratification, for specialist craftsmen, for monumental building projects, for trade networks, for all the markers we associate with organized society. What would their social organization have looked like? We can infer from universal human patterns. At the top, hereditary leadership, kings or chiefs whose authority derived from lineage, possibly claiming descent from gods or ancestors. The same pattern we see in every early civilization. A priestly class maintaining ritual knowledge, observing the sky, keeping calendars, performing ceremonies that validated the social order. A warrior class defending territory, raiding neighbors, the perpetual human pattern of organized violence. Craftsmen and specialists, people whose particular skills, whether in metallurgy or boat building or carving or weaving, freed them from food production and allowed them to focus on their craft. Farmers and fishers, the majority of the population, producing the surplus that supported everyone else. Traders moving goods between settlements, spreading ideas and technologies, and at the bottom, laborers and servants. people whose lack of specialized skills relegated them to the hardest physical work. This hierarchy is not speculation. It is the pattern human societies fall into whenever they exceed a certain size and complexity. 2. And if Ice Age coastal cultures achieved that size and complexity, they would have developed this structure. Their cultural achievements might have included oral epic traditions, the kind of sophisticated storytelling we see in the Iliad and Odyssey and Gilgamesh epic and the Vedas, all of which were oral compositions memorized and transmitted for generations before being written down. Humans have extraordinary capacity for verbal memory when trained from childhood, and oral cultures develop techniques for preserving vast amounts of information in poetic form. What myths might Ice Age cultures have created? What heroes and gods and cosmologies? We will never know, because oral tradition dies when the culture that maintains it dies, unless it is written down or survives in the myths of descendant cultures. Astronomical observation would have been central to any agricultural society, because planting and harvesting require knowledge of seasons, and seasons are determined by the sun's position, and tracking the sun requires watching the sky systematically. The same observations that let you know when to plant also tell you about moon phases, about planetary movements, about the slow shift of constellations over generations. Knowledge accumulates, and if a culture lasted for centuries or millennia in one location, their astronomical knowledge would become deep, deep enough that some fragments might survive the catastrophe and be preserved in later traditions that seem inexplicably sophisticated for their supposed time period. They would have had art and music. The cave paintings prove Ice Age humans created art. Why would coastal cultures not create art as well? And unlike cave paintings, which were in protected environments and thus survived, coastal art would have been on surfaces exposed to weather or materials that decayed in locations now underwater. It is gone, but its absence does not mean it did not exist. Musical instruments would have been made from wood, bone, reeds, materials that do not survive 12,000 years except in extraordinary preservation contexts. But the human capacity for music is universal, appears in every culture ever studied, and there is no reason to think Ice Age humans were different. The mention in Genesis of Jubal, the father of all those who play the harp and flute placed before the deluge, might be preserving memory of musical traditions from the pre-deluge world. Religion and philosophy, systems of meaning that explained the cosmos and humanity's place in it would have developed. What forms these took, we cannot know, but the impulse to create meaning, to ask why we exist and what happens after death, and how the world came to be, this is universal to humans. And the answers different cultures create, their gods and creation myths and moral codes, these would have been as diverse in the Ice Age as they are today. But here is what matters most. Whether this reconstruction is accurate in every detail is less important than recognizing that such a civilization was possible. Not certain, not proven, but possible. Humans had the cognitive capacity, they had the time, they had access to resources. The geography was favorable, and the same drives that led to civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the Indus Valley and China and Mesoamerica, the drive to cooperate, to build, to create, to pass knowledge to the next generation. These drives existed in Ice Age humans as well. The assumption that they remained primitive until some magical threshold was crossed 10,000 years ago is an assumption, not a proven fact. It is an assumption based on absence of evidence. And that absence might be the result of vanishing rather than actual absence. This is the uncomfortable possibility that our timeline is wrong, not because we are stupid, but because we are looking in the wrong places. That the sophistication we attribute to Sumer and Egypt as new inventions might actually be old knowledge being recovered. That the myths of golden ages and lost knowledge might preserve actual cultural memory. That the warnings about deluges and catastrophes might be based on real events. And that we building our own coastal civilization, concentrating our populations in exactly the same vulnerable locations, assuming our sophistication will protect us. Might be repeating a pattern that has played out before. They might have seen the catastrophe coming. If they had astronomical knowledge, if they had been watching the sky for generations, they might have detected the approaching comet. If the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, they would not have understood what it was. They had no concept of comets or impacts or cosmic threats. But they might have seen a new light in the sky, growing brighter night by night, and known that something was wrong. Their priests might have interpreted it as a divine omen. Their leaders might have ordered preparations, though preparations for what they could not know. Or perhaps there was no warning. Perhaps the impacts came from the direction of the sun and gave no advanced notice at all. Perhaps one morning dawned normally, and then the sky split and the world burned. Either way, the result was the same. The fires consumed the organic materials. The floods buried the cities. The sea level rise over the following millennia submerged everything. The Ice Age climate chaos killed most of the population. The survivors scattered to highlands and inland regions, carrying fragments of knowledge, telling stories of the world before, stories that would become myths. Myths that would be dismissed as fantasy until 12,000 years later we stand debating whether any of it was real. The civilization, if it existed, vanished. And we are left asking what they were like, what they knew, what they achieved, too. And whether we will be wise enough to learn from their vanishing or arrogant enough to believe it could never happen to us. If a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished, they would have left behind evidence. Not the kind of evidence we typically expect from archaeology. Not intact buildings and pottery collections and written libraries, because 12,000 years of fire and flood and erosion have destroyed those things. But subtler evidence, echoes, shadows, the kind of traces that survive not as physical objects, but as cultural memories preserved in myths, as anomalous structures that appear too sophisticated for their supposed time period, as knowledge that appears fully formed in later civilizations rather than developing gradually, and as the testimony of catastrophic geology that confirms something terrible happened exactly when the myths say it happened. This is not the evidence of presence. This is the evidence of vanishing. The footprints left behind by something that was removed. And when we examine these traces without the prejudice of the paradigm that says they cannot exist, a pattern emerges. A pattern consistent with what we would expect if a sophisticated culture had thrived during the Ice Age and been destroyed, leaving only scattered survivors to preserve fragments of what had been lost. The evidence exists. The question is whether we are willing to see it for what it might be. Begin with the myths, because the myths are the most comprehensive evidence we have. Not one culture's myths, but the myths of cultures worldwide, separated by oceans and thousands of years of independent development, all telling essentially the same story. A great deluge, divine or natural warning, survivors in boats or on mountaintops, animals and seeds preserved, landing on high ground, sacrifice and covenant, rebuilding from ruins. Over 200 distinct flood myths have been catalogued by anthropologists and folklorists from every inhabited continent, from cultures that had no contact with each other from the time they separated during human migrations out of Africa until European colonial period. And yet they all remember deluge, not just any deluge, a world-destroying deluge, a catastrophe so severe that the old world ended and a new world began. The standard academic explanation is that these myths arose independently from local flood experiences. Rivers overflow. Storms bring destructive rain. These local events become mythologized into cosmic narratives. This explanation sounds reasonable until you examine the specific details. It is not just that flooding is mentioned. It is that the sequence of events matches across cultures. Warning given beforehand. Time to prepare. Boat or ark construction. Loading of animals and food, duration specified, Usually 7 days or 40 days or similar. Waters covering everything, even mountains in many versions. Birds sent out to find dry land, landing on specific mountain, sacrifice to gods. Promise or covenant that deluge will not recur. These are not generic flood descriptions. These are specific narrative elements that repeat too consistently to be coincidental. Consider the mathematics. If flood myths arose independently, the probability that any two cultures would include all these specific elements is low, perhaps 1 in 10 for any given element. The probability that they all include most or all elements, by pure chance, is the product of those individual probabilities. The 1 in 10 times 1 in 10 times 1 in 10 repeated for each shared element. The numbers become astronomically small, 1 in millions or billions. And this is comparing just two cultures. When you have 200 cultures showing this pattern, the probability of coincidence approaches 0. The only reasonable explanation is shared historical memory. All these cultures are remembering the same event because all these cultures descended from populations that experienced that event. The survivors scattered. They carried the story with them as they migrated to different regions. And despite thousands of years of separation, despite complete linguistic and cultural divergence, the core story was preserved because the event was so traumatic, so world-ending that forgetting it was impossible. This is not speculation. This is the most parsimonious explanation for the data. And what the myths describe matches what geology tells us actually happened. Catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. Sea level rise of 400 feet over thousands of years with pulses of rapid rise that would have been devastating to coastal populations. Climate chaos during the Younger Dryas continental scale fires. Megafauna extinction. Human population collapse. The myths and the geology tell the same story, and both point to the conclusion that something terrible happened 12,000 years ago that destroyed whatever human cultures existed at the time. The Sumerian King List is not just a myth. It is a historical document, or it claims to be. Multiple copies exist, found in different cities, showing it was considered important enough to preserve and copy. And what it says is impossible to dismiss as simple mythology. It lists kings who ruled before the deluge. Not generic legendary figures, but specific names with specific reign lengths and specific cities where they ruled. Olulim of Eridu, Alangar of Eridu, and Menluana of Bad Tibura. The list continues through 8 kings in 5 cities, and then the statement the deluge swept over. After the deluge, kingship descended from heaven again, and the list continues with post-deluge dynasties. The structure is clear. The Sumerians believed that kingship, meaning organized civilization, existed before the deluge was interrupted by the deluge, and then was restored afterward. This is not a creation myth. This is a historical chronology that includes a catastrophe as a transitional event. The reign lengths are impossibly long by literal interpretation, yes, but as we examined previously, these might be dynastic lengths or compressed time periods or symbolic numbers rather than individual lifespans. What matters is the structure: pre-deluge civilization, catastrophe, post-deluge restoration, continuity through discontinuity. This is exactly what we would expect if the civilization that created these records was not inventing civilization for the first time, but was rebuilding and recovering knowledge from an earlier period. The Egyptian texts tell a parallel story. The pyramid texts carved into stone in pyramids at Saqqara around 2400 BC, but claiming to copy much older traditions, reference the Zep Tepi, the first time when gods walked the earth and established civilization. The Edfu temple building texts inscribed during the Ptolemaic period. But preserving older architectural and mythological traditions describe how the original temples were founded by 7 sages who came from a destroyed homeland, an island that had been overwhelmed by deluge. These sages traveled through Egypt teaching survivors how to build, how to perform rituals, how to organize society. They were preserving knowledge from the first time, knowledge that had been nearly lost when the primordial island was destroyed. This is not vague mythology. This is a specific claim. Civilization in Egypt did not begin with the first dynasty. It was founded by refugees or survivors from an earlier destroyed civilization who brought knowledge with them and used it to establish the sacred sites. Whether we interpret the seven sages as literal divine beings or as mythologized memory of actual knowledge bearers, the claim is the same. Knowledge came from before, from a time before the current age, from a world that ended. The Hindu Vedas describe the Satyuga, the Golden Age, when humans lived in harmony and righteousness, when lifespans were long, when knowledge was complete. This age ended, and the world declined through successive ages until reaching the current Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and decline. But the Vedas themselves are claimed to have been preserved through the deluge by Manu and the seven sages, the Saptarishi. The knowledge from the previous age was not lost entirely because these sages maintained it and transmitted it to the survivors. This pattern appears in tradition after tradition. Greek myths of Deucalion preserving humanity through the deluge. Chinese myths of the Great Flood that Gun and Yu had to control. Mesoamerican myths of previous worlds destroyed, including the fourth sun destroyed by deluge. In every case, the structure is the same. A world existed before that world ended in catastrophe. Survivors preserved fragments. Current civilization built on those fragments. This is not independent invention of generic disaster stories. This is consistent cultural memory of actual disaster preserved in the only way pre-literate or early literate cultures could preserve it through myth and oral tradition. Now consider Göbekli Tepe, because Göbekli Tepe should not exist according to the conventional timeline. Built around 9600 BC, just as the Younger Dryas was ending and just before the final catastrophic sea level rise. This site consists of massive stone circles, T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with sophisticated reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, requiring coordination of workers and techniques of quarrying and erecting megaliths that supposedly did not thousands of years exist for 1,000 years afterward. That's 1,000 years afterward. The standard explanation is that this represents an unexpected flowering of capability among hunter-gatherers, proving that complex society could emerge before agriculture. But this explanation requires assuming that people with no prior experience suddenly figured out megalithic construction techniques that later civilizations would take millennia to develop. The alternative explanation is simpler. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not inventing these techniques. They were applying knowledge inherited from earlier traditions. They were survivors or descendants of survivors from the coastal civilizations that had been destroyed, building in the highlands because the coasts were flooded, using what they remembered of construction methods their ancestors had developed. This would explain why Göbekli Tepe appears fully sophisticated rather than showing signs of experimental development. It would explain why similar megalithic techniques appear in multiple regions during the post-deluge period without clear gradual evolution. And it would explain why the site was deliberately buried around 8000 BC. Perhaps burying it preserved it, protected it, maintained it as a sacred memory of the knowledge that had been nearly lost. The same pattern appears with agriculture. The conventional narrative is that agriculture was invented independently in multiple regions around 10,000 BC. Wheat and barley domestication in the Fertile Crescent, rice in China, maize in Mesoamerica, potatoes in the Andes. All within a few thousand years of each other after hundreds of thousands of years of human existence without agriculture. The standard explanation is that climate change at the end of the Ice Age created favorable conditions and population pressure forced innovation. But another explanation is that agriculture was not invented but reinvented, that plant domestication had been practiced before the deluge. That knowledge of which plants to cultivate and how to select for desirable traits had existed in the coastal civilizations, and that survivors carried this knowledge with them when they fled inland. The spread of agriculture after the deluge would then represent not independent invention, but transmission of inherited knowledge modified and adapted to new environments and new plant species, but fundamentally based on principles that had been known before. The same applies to metallurgy. Copperworking appears around 5000 BC in the Near East, bronze around 300 BC. But these do not appear as crude experiments that gradually improve. They appear as sophisticated processes from the beginning. The knowledge of how to smelt copper from ore, how to create alloys by adding tin to produce bronze, how to cast and work and anneal metal. These are complex techniques requiring understanding of temperature control and material properties and repeated experimentation. If this knowledge was being developed from scratch, we should see clear progression from simple to complex. Instead, we see sophisticated metallurgy appearing suddenly. The alternative explanation. This knowledge existed before was lost in the catastrophe and was being recovered in the post-deluge period. The references in ancient texts to pre-deluge metallurgy, Tubal-Cain instructing in bronze and iron before the deluge might preserve memory of this earlier tradition. And the sudden appearance of metallurgical knowledge in multiple post-deluge civilizations might represent recovery of that tradition from the fragments preserved by survivors. Writing systems pose the same problem. Cuneiform appears in Sumer around 3200 BC, already capable of expressing complex abstract concepts. Not pictographs slowly evolving into phonetic script, but a fully functional writing system from its earliest examples. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear around the same time, similarly sophisticated from the beginning. Chinese writing, when it appears in the archaeological record, is already complex. The standard explanation is rapid development in response to administrative needs of early states. But writing is not simple. It requires conceptual framework of using symbols to represent sounds or ideas. It requires standardization so symbols are recognizable to different people. It requires transmission, teaching the system to others so it spreads. If writing was invented from scratch multiple times independently, we should see more evidence of the conceptual development. The alternative is that the concept of writing, the idea that symbols can preserve language, was known before and was being re-implemented in post-deluge civilizations using new symbol systems adapted to their languages, but based on the underlying concept that had been preserved from earlier times. Astronomical knowledge presents perhaps the most striking anomaly. The Sumerians and Babylonians had detailed knowledge of planetary movements, including planets not visible to the naked eye, and sophisticated mathematical models for predicting eclipses and planetary positions. The Egyptians oriented the pyramids to true north with precision that requires careful observation and understanding of stellar movement. Multiple ancient cultures knew about precession, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift gradually over centuries. Detecting precession requires consistent observation over hundreds of years, comparing records across generations. How did early civilizations have this knowledge? The standard explanation is patient observation and mathematical skill. But the amount of time and institutional continuity required seems to exceed what we know about early civilizations' capabilities. The alternative is that some of this astronomical knowledge was inherited, that cultures during the Ice Age living in one place for millennia had conducted the observations, that this preservage was through the catastrophe in oral tradition or in monuments encoding stellar alignments, that post-deluge civilizations were recovering, then discovering it, fravaning this knowledge, refining its knowledge for the first time. There are also the underwater anomalies sites that should not exist, but have been found by sonar or by divers in locations now submerged. The Gulf of Combat structures off the coast of India, geometric patterns at 120 feet depth that some argue are artificial, though mainstream archaeology disputes this. The Yonaguni Formation off Japan, an underwater structure with right angles and apparent steps that could be natural geological formation or could be worked stone, still debated. Atlit Yam, Israel, a confirmed Neolithic village underwater, 8,000 years old with stone structures and a stone circle, proving that sophisticated settlements existed on what are now submerged coastlines. Doggerland between Britain and Europe, where fishing trawlers pull up stone tools and mammoth bones from what was once inhabited land. These are not fantasies. These are documented discoveries, and they prove the principle. Sophisticated human settlements did exist on land that is now underwater. We have found some of them, which means there are probably others we have not found. Deeper, older, more eroded, waiting in locations we have not surveyed with technology capable of detecting them. The paradigm says lost civilization did not exist before 3,500 BC. But the paradigm has not conducted comprehensive underwater archaeology of Ice Age coastlines. The paradigm is an assumption that has not been tested. The evidence exists in fragments, in myths too consistent to be coincidence, in structures too sophisticated for their time, in knowledge appearing complete rather than developing, in underwater discoveries proving the principle, in geological confirmation of catastrophe. None of it is definitive proof. All of it is suggestive, and together it forms a pattern that says something existed before. Something was destroyed, something vanished so completely that we stand debating whether it was real. The question is whether we are willing to see the pattern for what it might be, or whether we will continue to dismiss each piece individually, never assembling them into the larger picture they suggest. The vanished civilization, if it existed, speaks through these fragments. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently, asking us to remember, asking us to look where we have not looked, asking us to consider what we have refused to consider. The evidence of vanishing is the evidence that survives vanishing. And it is whispering from beneath 400 feet of water, from the myths we dismiss, from the monuments we cannot explain, from the knowledge that appeared too early, asking us one question. What if? Vanishing is not a single event. It is not a moment when something ceases to exist. Vanishing is a process, a cascade of destruction that unfolds across time and space, removing not just the object, but every trace that the object ever existed, every pathway back to knowledge of it, every possibility of recovery. And if we are asking whether a lost civilization could have vanished before the Ancient Deluge, we must understand the mechanisms of disappearance. Not just that a catastrophe occurred, though the geological evidence proves catastrophe did occur, but how that catastrophe would have functioned as a vanishing force. How fire and water, and ice and time working together over 12,000 years could take cities and artifacts and written records, and the accumulated knowledge of generations, and remove them so completely that we stand debating whether anything was ever there. The answer lies in understanding what actually happened at the end of the Ice Age. Not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, where climate warmed gradually and sea levels rose slowly and humans adapted peacefully, but the violent reality preserved in geological layers and ice cores and impact markers. The reality of a world being destroyed in stages, first by cosmic catastrophe, then by climate chaos, then by flooding that continued for thousands of years, and finally by time itself. The ultimate eraser, wearing away what fire and water left behind until only shadows remain. 1,200 years ago, something struck the Earth. Whether it was a fragmented comet or a swarm of meteors or multiple impacts from a disintegrating celestial body, the evidence points to cosmic catastrophe at the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. This is not fringe theory anymore. This is increasingly mainstream science, though still debated, based on physical evidence found at dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form only under extreme pressure and temperature, the kind produced by meteor impacts or nuclear explosions. Platinum anomaly, concentrations of this element far above natural background levels. Platinum being common in asteroids but rare in Earth's crust. Magnetic microspherules. tiny beads of melted rock with magnetic properties consistent with impact debris scattered through the atmosphere. Shocked quartz. Quartz crystals showing distinctive fracture patterns that occur only from the pressure wave of impacts. And the black mat layer, a continent-wide deposit of charcoal-rich sediment representing the ash from fires that burned across North America. All of this dated to the same moment, 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas boundary, the beginning of the catastrophe. If impacts occurred, and the evidence strongly suggests they did, the immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. Consider what happens when a large meteor or comet fragment enters the atmosphere at 20 or 30 kilometers per second. The kinetic energy is enormous. When it strikes, whether it reaches the ground or explodes in the air, that energy is released instantly. Heat, pressure, shock wave. If the impacts occurred over the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America, as some researchers propose based on the distribution of impact markers, the consequences would multiply. Ice sheet was 2 miles thick in places. Impacts on ice would vaporize billions of tons of frozen water instantly. This water vaporizes into the atmosphere. It spreads and it falls as rain, not normal rain, torrential rain, continuous rain. The kind of rain that ancient texts describe as lasting 7 days and 7 nights of 40 days and 40 nights. Numbers that might be literal or might be symbolic for longer than we could believe. But in either case, describing precipitation on a scale that would flood river valleys, submerge lowlands, destroy anything not built on high ground. And this is just the water from vaporized ice. The heat from the impacts would also ignite fires. Vegetation across the impact zone would combust. Winds from the shock waves would spread the fires. Within hours, continent-scale burning. We see the evidence in the black mat charcoal layer found from Alaska to Mexico. Everything organic burning, forests, grasslands. And if human settlements existed in these regions, those settlements burning too. Wooden structures consumed, organic materials destroyed. People fleeing or dying, infrastructure collapsing. But the immediate destruction was only the beginning. The debris thrown into the atmosphere by the impacts, the smoke from the continental fires, the water vapor, all of this would have blocked sunlight. Impact winter, temperatures plummeting, not gradually over decades, but rapidly over months or years. The ice cores from Greenland show the temperature drop associated with the Younger Dryas onset, 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some records, within decades, possibly within years or even months. This is catastrophic climate change. Crops failing, wild food sources dying, animals migrating or dying, humans starving. And this cold period lasted not for a single winter but for 200 years. The 12 centuries of climate significantly colder than the warming trend that had preceded it. Glaciers that had been retreating stopped retreating or began advancing again. Ice sheets in some regions re-expanded. The world entered a mini-ice age triggered by cosmic catastrophe. And human populations already devastated by the initial impacts and fires now faced prolonged survival crisis, food scarcity, cold, disease following population stress. The genetic evidence shows bottleneck. Human populations crashed. Perhaps 90% died. Perhaps more, from millions to hundreds of thousands globally. Scattered survivors in refuges where resources remained sufficient for survival. And then 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. As suddenly as it began, temperatures reversed. Warming resumed. The ice sheets that had stabilized during the cold period began melting again. But now the melting was rapid, catastrophic, making up for the 200 years when melting had paused. This is when the final Great Deluge occurred, meltwater pulse 1b. The exact magnitude is debated, but most recent research suggests 10 to 15 meters of sea level rise, 30 to 50 feet, occurring over perhaps 200 to 500 years. That might sound slow, but it is geologically instantaneous, and the rise would not have been smooth. There is evidence of sudden surges, periods where ice dams holding back massive lakes of meltwater collapsed, releasing enormous volumes of water into the oceans in short periods. These pulses would have caused rapid sea level increases visible within a single human lifetime. A person born when the water was at one level could watch over decades the sea advancing inland, swallowing villages, forcing constant retreat until the coastal plains where they were born were completely underwater. This is what the myths describe. Not a single deluge lasting days or weeks, but a prolonged catastrophe where water kept rising year after year, generation after generation until the old world was drowned. For any civilization that had existed on the coastal plains, this sequence of catastrophes would have been extinction level. The initial impacts and fires would have destroyed immediate infrastructure, killed populations in impact zones, forced survivors to flee. The Younger Dryas climate chaos would have continued the destruction through starvation and cold for 12 centuries, preventing any recovery or rebuilding during that entire period. And then the final flooding would have submerged whatever had survived the fire and the cold, burying it under rising seas, covering the coastal plains where civilization would have concentrated with 400 feet of water over the following millennia. This is not destruction. This is vanishing. First burning away the organic materials, then killing most of the population so there are few survivors to remember, then drowning the ruins so no one can access them, then waiting 12,000 years while sediment buries what was drowned. While marine organisms cover artificial structures with coral and growth, making them look natural, while currents redistribute and wear away anything exposed. The mechanism is perfect. If you wanted to design a process that would cause civilization to vanish so completely that future archaeologists could not find it, you could not improve on what actually happened. But let us be specific about what this means for evidence. Consider a coastal city hypothetically existing on what is now the continental shelf 12,800 years ago, built primarily from wood with stone foundations and possibly some bronze or copper artifacts, housing perhaps 10,000 people. The impacts occur. If the city is near the impact zone, it burns completely. If it is farther away, it experiences earthquakes from the shock waves, fires from spreading conflagration, torrential rain flooding streets, and collapsing mud brick or wooden buildings. Most of the population dies in the immediate catastrophe or the following famine. Perhaps 1,000 survive by fleeing inland. They cannot return. The city is destroyed, burned, flooded, abandoned. Over the next 200 years of Younger Dryas, what remains of the city sits empty, exposed to weather. Wood that did not burn rots. Metal corrodes. Stone weathers. Vegetation grows over the ruins, roots breaking apart foundations. Without maintenance, structures collapse. By the time the Younger Dryas ends, the city is already ruins of ruins barely recognizable as artificial. And then the sea level rise begins. The water advances, first covering the outskirts, then the entire site. By the time sea levels stabilize 8,000 years ago, the city is under 200 feet of water. Over the next 8,000 years, sediment from rivers and coastal erosion gradually buries it. Marine organisms colonize exposed stones. Currents shift materials. The site becomes an undifferentiated mound on the ocean floor covered with sediment and marine growth, too indistinguishable from natural seafloor topography unless you know exactly where it is and survey it with ground-penetrating sonar capable of detecting buried structures. And we have not done this. We have not systematically surveyed the continental shelves looking for buried structures. We have not drilled cores through the sediment screening for artifacts. We have looked at a tiny fraction of the area where evidence would be, found nothing in that tiny fraction, and concluded nothing exists anywhere. The same vanishing process applies to every aspect of civilization. Written records, if they existed, would have been on organic materials. Wood, bark hide, early paper, all of these burn or rot within centuries. Stone inscriptions survive longer but erode after 12,000 years, especially after submersion in salt water and burial under sediment. Inscriptions would be worn smooth. Knowledge encoded in oral tradition survives only if the culture maintaining that tradition survives. When 90% of the population dies, when survivors scatter to different refuges, when survival becomes the only priority and there is no surplus for maintaining specialist knowledge keepers, oral tradition degrades rapidly. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge becomes vague, memory becomes mythic story. Technological knowledge, how to smelt bronze or build boats or construct megalithic structures, survives only if there are people practicing those technologies. If the specialists die, if the infrastructure necessary for those technologies is destroyed, if survivors do not have access to raw materials, the knowledge becomes theoretical rather than practical. You might remember that your ancestors worked bronze, but if you do not have copper and tin and furnaces hot enough, you cannot work bronze yourself. The knowledge becomes a story. They say the ancients could work magic stones that were hard as wood but shiny. Over generations, even the stories fade, and the few fragments that survive, preserved in the myths of descendant cultures, are dismissed as fantasy by later academics who assume that because the capabilities described seem impossible for that time period, they must be inventions rather than memories. Geography itself conspires in the vanishing. The best locations for civilization, the coastal plains, are now underwater. This is not minor detail. This is fundamental problem. 40% of modern humans live within 100 kilometers of the coast. And this proportion has probably been constant throughout human history because coasts offer optimal conditions, moderate climate, access to marine food resources, flat terrain, rivers for fresh water and transportation. These advantages existed during the Ice Age just as they exist now. So Ice Age civilizations, if they existed, would have concentrated on coasts. But those coasts are now submerged. The Thames River during the Ice Age extended far beyond London out into what is now the North Sea before reaching the ocean. The Mississippi extended far beyond New Orleans into what is now the Gulf of Mexico. The Nile Delta extended much farther into what is now the Mediterranean. These river mouth regions, estuaries, are among the most productive environments for human settlement. Rich in fish, waterfowl, fertile soil from river sediment, fresh water meeting salt water creating biological abundance. And all of them are now underwater. We are searching for Ice Age civilization in the highlands, in the interior regions, in marginal territories where few people would have lived. We are excavating caves in mountains and finding sparse remains and concluding Ice Age humans were primitive. But this is like excavating only the Rocky Mountains today and concluding modern humans were primitive because you find no cities at 12,000 feet elevation. You are looking in the wrong place. The cities are on the coasts, and the Ice Age cities, if they existed, are also on the coasts, 400 feet down. The mathematics of vanishing are brutal. If a civilization left 1 million artifacts, structures and tools and artworks and buildings, and all the physical remnants of culture, and if the vanishing rate over 12,000 years is 99.9%, which is conservative given the mechanisms we have described, then 1,000 artifacts survive. 1,000 out of 1 million. And those 1,000 are scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean floor, buried under meters of sediment, corroded and weathered and overgrown to the point where they look like natural objects unless examined closely. The probability of finding any of them without systematic search is essentially zero. And we have not conducted systematic search. We have found a few anomalies, the underwater structures that are debated as artificial or natural. We have found coastal Neolithic sites like Atlit Yam that prove the principle that settlements are submerged. But we have not mounted comprehensive expeditions to survey all the likely areas where Ice Age cities would have been using advanced sonar and magnetometry and drilling cores and excavating promising anomalies. The cost would be enormous. Hundreds of millions of dollars, decades of work, and funding committees ask the reasonable question: what is the probability of success? And the honest answer is unknown. We do not know what is there because we have not looked. But not knowing is interpreted as probably nothing, and probably nothing does not get funded. So we do not look, And not looking we do not find. And not finding the paradigm is confirmed. The circular reasoning is perfect. But there is one more dimension of vanishing that deserves attention. Intentional vanishing, not by the catastrophe, but by the survivors. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC has never been adequately explained. Why would people carefully fill in those stone circles with debris, burying them, preserving them? One possibility is that they knew. They knew that catastrophe had destroyed the old world. They knew that rising waters were continuing to swallow the lands where their ancestors had lived. And they knew that knowledge needed to be preserved. So they built monuments encoding that knowledge. And then they buried them, protecting them, ensuring they would survive for future generations to discover. This is speculation, but it fits the pattern. And if Göbekli Tepe was deliberately preserved, what else might have been deliberately hidden? What knowledge caches might exist in locations we have not searched, buried intentionally in geologically stable areas, waiting for someone wise enough to look? The survivors of the catastrophe would have understood, in a way we do not, how fragile knowledge is. They had watched their world burn and drown. They had seen libraries destroyed, cities submerged, specialists die without passing on their knowledge. They would have been desperate to prevent total loss. And perhaps they succeeded in preserving fragments. Perhaps the megalithic monuments that appear across the post-deluge world are not just religious structures or tomes. Perhaps they are memory banks, stone archives encoding in their proportions and alignments, and carvings the essential knowledge that survivors were determined should not be lost again. And perhaps, when we treat them only as primitive monuments, rather than potential information storage systems, we are missing what they were trying to tell us. The Ancient Deluge was not just a natural disaster. It was nature's eraser, operating through multiple mechanisms over thousands of years to remove all traces of whatever existed before. Fire to destroy organic materials, cold to kill populations and prevent recovery, water to submerge ruins, sediment to bury what was submerged, erosion to wear away what was exposed. Time to complete the vanishing, 12,000 years of weathering and transformation until even stone becomes unrecognizable. And the result is what we see today. Absence. Not absence of civilization, but absence of surviving evidence of civilization. The silence of the ocean floor, the blank space in the archaeological record between 40,000 years ago when cave paintings prove humans were sophisticated, and 10,000 years ago when agriculture appears. That blank space is not empty because nothing happened. It is empty because what happened vanished. The coastal civilizations, if they existed, are gone, removed so completely that we debate whether they existed. And that debate itself is evidence of vanishing. Because if the removal was not comprehensive, we would not be debating. We would have found enough evidence to settle the question. The fact that the question remains open, that reasonable people can argue both sides, proves that whatever was there has been removed to the point of ambiguity. And ambiguity in the face of catastrophic vanishing should be interpreted not as evidence of absence, but as exactly what we should expect if presence was systematically erased. The deluge was real, the vanishing was comprehensive, and the civilization that vanished, if it existed, is now beyond our reach, unless we are willing to search where it actually was, 400 feet down, buried under sediment, waiting in the silence of the vanished. The silence that asks us to remember what we have forgotten, or to finally look where we have refused to look before we become the next civilization that vanishes. And the cycle continues, and the question echoes forward through time unanswered once more. We have established that catastrophe occurred. We have examined the mechanisms by which fire and flood and time can remove physical traces. But there is a difference between understanding that vanishing is theoretically possible and understanding the practical step-by-step process by which an entire civilization disappears from the archaeological record, so 12,000 years later we debate it, whether it existed. Vanishing is not magic, it is not instantaneous, it is a grinding, relentless process that operates on multiple time scales through multiple mechanisms, attacking every category of evidence simultaneously until what remains is so fragmentary and ambiguous that absence becomes indistinguishable from non-existence. And if we are to understand why we cannot find definitive proof of pre-deluge civilization, we must understand this process in detail. Not just what happened, but what happens to each type of material, each category of artifact, each form of knowledge when subjected to 12,000 years of geological transformation. We must understand why looking at the land that survived the deluge is looking in the wrong place. Why conventional archaeology is using methods designed to find recent history and failing to find ancient history. And why the absence of evidence given the sample size we have actually examined proves nothing except that we have not yet looked hard enough in the right locations. Begin with the most fundamental problem, material decay. Everything physical degrades over time, but different materials decay at different rates. And understanding these rates is essential to understanding why almost nothing survives 12,000 years. Organic materials decay fastest. Wood under normal conditions exposed to air and moisture and microorganisms rots completely within centuries. Exceptional preservation requires either complete dryness like Egyptian tombs or complete waterlogging in anaerobic conditions like bog bodies or freezing like mammoths in permafrost. But these are exceptions. Under normal coastal conditions, where an Ice Age civilization would have built, wood exposed to rain and sun and biological activity is gone within a few thousand years maximum. After 12,000 years, zero wood survives in recognizable form. It has decomposed completely, returned to soil with no trace that it was ever worked by human hands. Paper, parchment bark leather, textiles, rope, baskets, all organic materials that civilizations use extensively follow the same pattern. Gone within thousands of years at most. After 12,000 years, complete disappearance. If the pre-deluge civilization kept records on wood or bark or early paper, those records are gone. If they wore clothing, made rope, wove baskets, all of that is gone. If they built entirely from wood with only stone foundations, the buildings are gone and only the foundations might survive. And even those would be so weathered and buried that identifying them as artificial requires careful excavation and analysis. Metals fare only slightly better, and the timeline depends on the specific metal and environmental conditions. Copper and bronze oxidize, forming green or brown patina and gradually corrode. In dry conditions, bronze objects can survive thousands of years, which is why we find Bronze Age artifacts in Mediterranean sites from 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. But 12,000 years is 3 to 4 times longer. And in wet coastal environments, particularly salt water, corrosion accelerates dramatically. Bronze exposed to seawater corrodes within centuries, becoming unrecognizable within millennia. After 12,000 years submerged, even large bronze objects would be reduced to corroded lumps or completely dissolved with the copper dispersed as minerals in the sediment. Iron corrodes even faster. Iron rusts, iron oxide forming on the surface and progressively consuming the metal. In wet environments, iron artifacts from 2,000 years ago are often corroded beyond recognition. After 12,000 years, iron has returned completely to iron oxide, indistinguishable from natural iron ore. If you found it, you could not tell it had ever been worked. Gold is the most stable metal. Large gold objects can survive indefinitely because gold does not corrode or oxidize. But thin gold objects dissolve slowly. Gold leaf or thin wire would not survive 12,000 years, and even large gold objects would be buried, scattered. Impossible to distinguish from natural gold nuggets or deposits without careful examination. The lesson is clear. Metal artifacts from 12,000 years ago would be rare, corroded, difficult to identify, and located on the ocean floor, buried under sediment in places we have not systematically searched. Ceramics and stones survive longer, but are still vulnerable. Pottery, baked clay, is among the most durable human-made materials. Pottery shards from 5,000 or 6,000 years ago are common finds. But pottery also breaks after 12,000 years of freeze-thaw cycles, chemical weathering, and mechanical breakdown. Pottery shards become smaller and smaller until they are indistinguishable from sediment. Only pottery that was buried immediately and remained undisturbed would survive in recognizable form. Stone is most durable. Megalithic structures. Massive worked stone can survive tens of thousands of years. But even stone erodes. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic rain, losing approximately 1 millimeter per 1,000 years in temperate climates. After 12,000 years, 12 millimeters of surface removed. Any carvings or inscriptions would be significantly degraded or completely worn smooth. Sandstone erodes faster in wind and rain. Granite is most durable, but still weathers at measurable rates. After 12,000 years, even granite structures would show significant erosion. Sharp edges would be rounded. Surfaces would be pitted and weathered. And if the structures were underwater, as Ice Age coastal structures would be, additional weathering from currents and marine organisms would accelerate degradation. The result is that stone structures from 12,000 years ago would look ancient, would look weathered, would look so degraded that identifying them as artificial rather than natural formations becomes genuinely difficult without excavation and detailed analysis. Now add burial, because most structures do not remain exposed for 12,000 years. They get buried under accumulated sediment. Rivers constantly carry sediment toward the ocean. Coastal zones accumulate sediment from rivers and from erosion. The rate varies by location, but in many coastal areas, sediment accumulates at rates of meters per 1,000 years. After 12,000 years, that is tens of meters of burial. Everything that existed on the surface is now buried under that much overburden, completely invisible from the surface unless you drill or excavate. And sediment is not passive. As it accumulates, it compresses. The weight of overlying sediment squeezes water out of lower layers, compacting them, transforming mud into shale, sand into sandstone. This transformation destroys fine details, pottery pressed flat, delicate objects crushed. By the time you excavate through 12,000 years of sediment accumulation, what you find is compressed, transformed, often unrecognizable without laboratory analysis. And again, we have not done this systematically. We have not drilled cores through continental shelf sediments, searching for archaeological evidence at appropriate depths. We drill for oil and gas and geological research. But the drillers are not screening for artifacts. If they pulled up a worked stone or metal fragment in a core from 200 feet below the seafloor, they might not recognize it as significant. It would be logged as rock or mineral, catalogued by depth and composition, and archived or discarded. The evidence might be passing through our hands without being recognized. Geological processes compound the vanishing through active transformation. Tectonic activity, the constant movement of Earth's crust, affects everything. Coastal regions are often tectonically active because they are at or near plate boundaries. Earthquakes occur repeatedly over millennia. Each earthquake shifts and cracks and collapses structures. After 12,000 years and hundreds or thousands of earthquakes, cumulative damage is enormous. Stone structures that might have survived erosion are now collapsed rubble. Foundations are shifted off alignment. Buildings that were standing are now tumbled blocks scattered across the seafloor, indistinguishable from natural rockfall unless carefully mapped and analyzed. Subduction, where one tectonic plate slides beneath another, actually destroys seafloor completely, carrying it into the mantle to be melted and recycled. Ocean floor is recycled approximately every 180 million years, meaning most very ancient seafloor is gone. But even in regions not being subducted, seafloor spreading and plate movement means the coastline of 12,000 years ago is not in the same position as the current coastline. The entire geography has shifted. Finding specific sites requires understanding plate tectonics and reconstructing where the ancient coastline would have been relative to current positions. This is not impossible, but it adds complexity to an already difficult search. Then there is chemical transformation. Over thousands of years, chemical processes alter materials at the molecular level. Clay becomes cemented into solid rock. Sand becomes sandstone. Organic materials in the right conditions become fossilized, but fossilization requires rapid burial and specific chemical environments and is rare. Most organic materials simply decompose without fossilization. Metals corrode through oxidation and other chemical reactions. Even glass, which we think of as permanent, slowly devitrifies, losing transparency, becoming opaque, and eventually returning to sand-like mineral grains after 12,000 years, especially underwater, where chemical reactions are facilitated by dissolved minerals in seawater. Chemical transformation is extensive. The materials we are looking for no longer have the chemical composition they originally had. This makes identification difficult. If you find corroded bronze, you need chemical analysis to determine it was bronze rather than natural copper minerals. If you find degraded ceramics, you need to distinguish them from natural clay deposits. Without systematic chemical screening of sediment samples, you could miss evidence entirely. Marine processes add another layer of complexity. Once structures are underwater, they are subjected to marine erosion from currents to biological colonization by corals and sponges and barnacles to chemical weathering from salt water. Over 1,000 years, artificial structures become covered with marine growth, encrusted with layers of biological material, looking increasingly like natural reef formations. The Yonaguni Formation off Japan is controversial precisely because it is so overgrown and weathered that experts disagree whether the right angles and apparent terraces are artificial or natural. Currents redistribute sediment, sometimes exposing structures, sometimes burying them deeper. Storm surges move large objects. Hurricanes reshape the seafloor. Over 12,000 years, even large structures can be scattered, moved from their original positions, making it impossible to reconstruct the original layout without extensive excavation. And marine organisms are not just passive colonizers. Some actively break down materials. Wood-boring organisms consume wooden shipwrecks within centuries. Stone-boring organisms create holes in rock. After 12,000 years underwater, the cumulative effect of biological, chemical, and physical marine processes is that artificial structures look natural. They blend into the seafloor. Only careful examination reveals their artificial origin. Now, consider the search problem, because even if evidence survives in some form, finding it requires searching in the right places with appropriate methods. The continental shelves. The submerged coastal plains where Ice Age civilizations would have built cover approximately 27 million square kilometers globally. That is an area roughly the size of Africa. We need to search this entire area at high resolution to detect buried structures. Current status? We have mapped perhaps 1% of this area with sufficient resolution to detect large features. We have conducted detailed archaeological investigation of less than 1,000th of 1%. The cost of comprehensive underwater survey using advanced sonar, magnetometry, and drilling would be in the billions of dollars over decades, and funding bodies ask, what is the expected return? If the probability of finding definitive evidence is low, which it is given the vanishing mechanisms we have described, and the cost is high, which it is, then the research does not get funded. So we continue to sample tiny fractions of the potential area, and finding nothing in those tiny fractions, we extrapolate to conclude nothing exists in the vast areas we have not sampled. This is like examining 1 square mile of the Sahara Desert, finding no oil, and concluding there is no oil anywhere in Africa. The logic is obviously flawed, but it is the logic currently applied to the question of pre-deluge civilization. Even when we do search underwater, we often use methods designed to find recent shipwrecks rather than ancient settlements. Sonar that detects metal but not stone. Visual surveys that look for intact structures rather than buried foundations. Timescales focused on thousands of years rather than tens of thousands. excavation techniques from terrestrial archaeology that do not transfer well to underwater environments. We are not deliberately ignoring the possibility of Ice Age sites. We are simply using methods optimized for finding what we expect to find. And we do not expect to find Ice Age civilizations underwater. So our methods are not designed to detect them. If we wanted to search properly, we would need to develop new methods. Ground-penetrating sonar capable of imaging through tens of meters of sediment. Drilling programs systematically sampling continental shelf sediments at depths corresponding to Ice Age surfaces. Chemical analysis of sediment cores screening for anthropogenic markers. Elevated metals or unusual isotope ratios or organic compounds that indicate human activity. Bathymetric surveys at extremely high resolution looking for geometric patterns or anomalies in seafloor topography. We have the technology to do all of this. We simply have not applied it systematically because the paradigm says there is nothing to find. So why spend the resources searching? There is also the paradigm problem itself, which functions as a form of vanishing by preventing recognition of evidence, even when it is found. When anomalies are discovered, when underwater structures are found that might be artificial, the default interpretation is natural formation unless proven otherwise. And proof is difficult because weathering and burial make definitive identification challenging. So ambiguous cases are resolved in favor of natural explanation because that is the conservative scientific position and the evidence is dismissed. When ancient texts describe sophisticated pre-deluge cultures, they are interpreted as mythology rather than compressed history because the paradigm says sophisticated cultures did not exist before a certain date. So the texts must be invention. When megalithic structures appear too early in the timeline, they are called anomalies or exceptions rather than evidence that the timeline is wrong. The paradigm acts as a filter. It determines what counts as evidence and what counts as noise. And it is self-reinforcing. Evidence that supports the paradigm is accepted readily. Evidence that challenges the paradigm is scrutinized intensely and usually rejected. This is not conspiracy or deliberate suppression. This is normal science protecting its models from premature overthrow. But it means that evidence of pre-deluge civilization, even if found, might not be recognized for what it is until enough evidence accumulates to force paradigm shift. And accumulating that evidence is difficult when research proposals challenging the paradigm are not funded. The combined effect of all these vanishing mechanisms is devastating. Material decay removes most artifacts. Burial hides what remains. Chemical and geological transformation alters materials beyond easy recognition. Marine processes cover structures with growth and make them look natural. Inadequate sampling means we have not searched the right places. Inappropriate methods mean we might miss evidence even where we search. And paradigm bias means anomalies are explained away rather than investigated. The system is designed unintentionally, but effectively to prevent discovery of pre-deluge civilization, even if it existed. This is not to say discovery is impossible. Anomalies have been found. Atlit Yam proves submerged Neolithic sites exist. Geo-Beakley proves sophisticated construction occurred earlier than expected. Doggerland proves inhabited land is now underwater. These discoveries chip away at the paradigm. But definitive proof, the kind that would force mainstream acceptance, requires finding sites that are unambiguous, large structures clearly artificial, artifacts in primary context, multiple independent sites showing pattern. And finding this requires systematic, comprehensive search with appropriate methods, and willingness to interpret ambiguous evidence generously rather than dismissively. The question is not whether evidence exists. The question is whether evidence could survive 12,000 years of vanishing, and whether we have searched adequately to find it if it did survive. The answer to the first question is barely in exceptional circumstances as fragments. The answer to the second question is no. We have not searched adequately. We have sampled less than 1% of the relevant area. We have used methods not optimized for detecting ancient sites, and we have interpreted ambiguous findings conservatively rather than as potential evidence. Until we search comprehensively, until we survey the continental shelves systematically with appropriate technology, until we excavate promising anomalies rather than dismissing them, until we screen sediment cores for anthropogenic markers, until we approach the question without the bias that says nothing is there, so why look, we cannot definitively say whether pre-deluge civilization existed or not. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, when the absence might be the result of comprehensive vanishing combined with inadequate searching. The vanishing was real. The mechanisms are understood, and the conclusion is unavoidable. If lost civilization existed 12,000 years ago on the coastal plains that are now 400 feet underwater, we would not expect to find obvious evidence using conventional archaeological methods applied to the land that survived the deluge. We would expect exactly what we see: fragmentary hints, anomalies, myths, geological evidence of catastrophe, and absence of definitive proof. Not because nothing was there, but because vanishing was comprehensive and search has been minimal. The civilization, if it existed, has vanished. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge that vanishing and search where they actually were, rather than continuing to look where they were not and concluding our failure to find proves they never existed. Vanishing is never total. Even when catastrophe destroys a civilization so completely that its cities are submerged and its artifacts are scattered and its written records are burned, something survives. Not the civilization itself, but fragments, echoes, the memories carried by those who escaped the destruction. And if we are asking whether a lost civilization vanished before the Ancient Deluge, we must ask the companion question: who survived? How did they survive? What fragments of knowledge did they carry with them? And how did those fragments influence the civilizations that emerged afterward? Because this is where the vanished civilization becomes visible again. Not in the ruins we cannot find, but in the anomalies of the post-deluge world. In the sudden appearance of sophisticated capabilities that should have required centuries to develop, but appeared fully formed. In the myths that consistently described knowledge bearers teaching survivors how to rebuild. In the references to golden ages and first times and previous worlds that existed before the current age. The survivors are the bridge between the vanished world and our world. They are the transmission mechanism that carried fragments forward. And if we can understand who they were and what they preserved, we can reconstruct at least the shadow of what was lost. The genetic evidence tells us that human populations crashed around 12,000 years ago. This is not speculation. This is data from multiple studies analyzing genetic diversity and working backward to estimate population sizes at different points in history. The bottleneck is visible from perhaps 5 to 10 million people globally at the peak. The population collapsed to perhaps 100,000 to 500,000. The exact numbers are uncertain, but the pattern is clear. 90 to 95% of humanity died in a relatively short period. This matches what the myths describe. Not everyone perishing, but nearly everyone. A catastrophic die-off, leaving scattered remnant populations struggling to survive. Who were these survivors? Where did they survive? The answer necessarily is that they survived in locations that were not directly devastated by the initial catastrophe and that remained viable during the prolonged crisis that followed. Not the coastal plains which burned in the fires and flooded as sea levels rose. Not regions covered by advancing glaciers during the Younger Dryas. Not areas where climate became too extreme for survival, but highland refuges, interior locations near lakes or rivers that provided fresh water and resources, isolated valleys and plateaus that were protected from the worst effects, caves in some cases, though caves would have been temporary refuges rather than permanent homes, and critically those who had boats and could escape the immediate destruction, floating on the rising waters, searching for land that remained above the deluge. The requirements for survival were straightforward but demanding. You needed to be at elevation high enough that the rising waters did not reach you, or mobile enough to keep moving to higher ground as the waters rose. You needed access to fresh water because you cannot survive without drinking water, and this meant living near springs or streams or lakes. You needed food sources, whether through hunting, fishing, foraging, or eventually primitive agriculture. You needed shelter from cold during the Younger Dryas climate reversal, which meant caves or the ability to build insulated structures or locations where climate remained moderate despite global cooling. You needed small communities because humans are social animals and isolated individuals do not survive long term, but not populations so large that resources were overwhelmed. And critically, you needed knowledge. Even basic survival in harsh conditions requires skills. How to make fire, how to hunt or fish effectively, how to identify edible plants, how to build shelter, how to treat injuries and illnesses. Populations that survived were those that had this knowledge and could apply it. Populations that lacked these skills died, but not all survivors were equal. Some were from marginal populations, highland herders or interior foragers who already lived in the regions that would become refuges. These populations would have had local knowledge of their environments and survival skills appropriate to harsh conditions. They would have survived by continuing to do what they had always done, though under more difficult circumstances during the Younger Dryas. But other survivors were refugees from the coastal civilizations that were destroyed, fleeing inland ahead of the fires and floods, carrying with them not the full knowledge of their civilization, which required infrastructure and specialists and accumulated libraries, but fragments. What individuals could remember, what could be carried, what could be preserved through oral tradition as populations scattered and regrouped. These were the knowledge bearers, the apkallu, the watchers, the seven sages, the ones who became mythologized in later traditions as divine teachers because the knowledge they carried seemed so advanced compared to the survival-focused skills of the other refugees they encountered. Consider what fragments would be preserved in such circumstances. Practical knowledge survives best because it has immediate utility. If you know how to work metal, that skill is valuable and will be taught to apprentices. If you know which plants are medicinal, that knowledge is life-saving and will be carefully transmitted. If you know how to build boats or weave textiles or create pottery, these are skills that improve quality of life and will be maintained. But specialized theoretical knowledge, knowledge that requires infrastructure or leisure or institutional support, this is vulnerable. Mathematics beyond basic counting and measurement, astronomical knowledge beyond what is needed for tracking seasons, architectural principles for massive construction, when there is no surplus labor for building literary traditions, when there is no writing material. This knowledge becomes theoretical rather than practical. It is remembered but not applied. And over generations, theoretical knowledge degrades. The details are forgotten. The principles become simplified until what remains are fragments. The ancestors knew the movements of stars. The old ones could build great stone structures. Before the deluge, there were cities that touched the sky. These statements preserve the memory that knowledge existed without preserving the knowledge itself. And they are dismissed by later generations as exaggeration or myth, because the knowledge to verify them has been lost. The myths describe this process explicitly. The Mesopotamian tradition of the Apkallu, the seven sages who lived before the deluge and taught civilization to humans afterward, is not vague. These figures are named Adapa, Yunna, Emajurana and others. They are described as having specific domains of knowledge. One taught writing, one taught mathematics, one taught astronomy, one taught architecture. After the deluge, according to the tradition preserved by the Babylonian priest Berosus, these sages taught the survivors everything necessary to rebuild civilization, how to cultivate crops, how to build cities, how to establish laws. This is not describing gods creating civilization from nothing. This is describing knowledge transmission from those who remembered the old world to those who were trying to create a new one. The Egyptian tradition of the 7 sages who came from a destroyed island homeland and traveled through Egypt founding sacred sites is parallel. These sages are described as bringing knowledge of temple construction, ritual, astronomy, and governance. They are the founders of the Zep Tepi, the first time, the golden age before the dynasties. Again, this is knowledge transmission. The Hindu tradition of the Saptarishi, the 7 sages who preserved the Vedas through the deluge with Manu, describes the same pattern. Knowledge would have been lost was preserved by specific individuals who then spread it to the surviving populations. Even the biblical and apocryphal traditions preserve this pattern. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, the angels who descended and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, weapons, cosmetics, astrology, the knowledge of clouds and earth signs, the courses of the sun and moon. The text presents this as transgression, as knowledge that should not have been given. But if we strip away the theological framework, what remains is a description of technological knowledge being transmitted from one group to another. And this knowledge is placed before the deluge in the timeline. After the deluge, humanity had to rebuild, but some knowledge had been transmitted and survived. The details vary between traditions, but the structure is identical. Before the catastrophe, knowledge existed. The catastrophe destroyed the civilization that held that knowledge. But some knowledge bearers survived. They taught the survivors. This allowed civilization to restart rather than beginning from absolute zero. The question is how much knowledge was actually preserved, and the answer necessarily is not much in absolute terms, but enough to make a difference. Practical skills like agriculture and animal domestication appear to have been preserved effectively because these have obvious immediate utility and are relatively easy to transmit. You can teach someone to plant seeds and tend crops in a season. You can teach animal husbandry in a generation. These skills spread rapidly through post-deluge populations because they provided obvious advantages. Metallurgy also appears to have been preserved in fragmentary form. The knowledge that certain rocks, when heated, produce metal, that mixing metals creates alloys with better properties. But the full industrial knowledge of furnace construction and ore processing and alloying ratios. This required rediscovery through experimentation. So metallurgy reappears in the post-deluge world not as a complete technology package, but as a concept that had to be elaborated. Astronomical knowledge was partially preserved, probably through a combination of oral tradition, teaching people to watch specific stars for seasonal markers, and possibly through monuments encoding alignments. But the deep observational knowledge that requires centuries of continuous sky watching this would have been lost and had to be rebuilt. Architectural knowledge presents an interesting case. The appearance of megalithic construction across the post-deluge world from Göbekli Tepe to Malta to Britain to Peru using similar techniques despite no contact between regions suggests that the basic principles of working and moving large stones were known and transmitted. But the specific engineering knowledge for complex structures had to be rediscovered. So we see impressive megalithic monuments appearing relatively early in the post-deluge period, demonstrating that the concept of monumental stone construction was preserved. But we also see experimentation and development as cultures worked out the details. Writing is probably the most significant loss. If writing existed before the deluge, it was lost almost completely. Only the concept survived. The idea that symbols can preserve language, too. And this concept was reinvented multiple times, independently, creating different writing systems in different regions, because the specific symbol systems from before the deluge had not been transmitted. What survived was the knowledge that writing was possible and useful, not the actual writing systems themselves. This pattern of partial preservation explains much about the post-deluge archaeological record. Why do sophisticated capabilities appear suddenly, rather than developing gradually? Because they are being recovered rather than invented. Why do multiple regions show similar developments at roughly the same time period? Because they are all receiving knowledge from the same source. The pool of survivors who carried fragments from the pre-deluge world. Why does knowledge appear and disappear, with some early cultures showing capabilities that later cultures lose and have to rediscover? Because the knowledge was fragmentary and transmission was unreliable. Some populations received certain fragments. Others received different fragments. And when populations were isolated during the recovery period, knowledge could be lost in one region while being maintained in another. The pattern is not consistent cultural evolution from simple to complex. The pattern is irregular recovery with bursts of sophistication followed by periods of stagnation or even decline as populations struggled to maintain knowledge they had partially received but did not fully understand. The timeline of this recovery process is important. The catastrophe occurred 12,800 years ago. The Younger Dryas climate crisis lasted until 11,600 years ago. This 200-year period would have been pure survival. Populations scattered, resources scarce, climate harsh. Very little cultural development would have occurred. Survival was the priority. After the Younger Dryas ended, conditions improved, climate warmed, resources became more abundant, populations began growing again. And this is when we see the first signs of recovery. Göbekli Tepe is built around 9600 BC, just after the Younger Dryas ends. This is not coincidence. This is the first opportunity for populations to divert resources to non-survival activities like building monuments. The appearance of agriculture around 10,000 BC in multiple regions follows the same pattern. Not invention from necessity during the crisis, but implementation of inherited knowledge once conditions allowed. The development continues over thousands of years, gradually increasing in sophistication as more knowledge is recovered and populations grow large enough to support specialists. By 3500 BC, when Sumer emerges as a fully urban civilization, we are looking at 8,000 years of gradual recovery from the catastrophe. Not rapid development from primitiveness, but slow rebuilding from near total loss. The survivors themselves would have experienced this as tragedy. They would have known what had been lost. They would have seen the cities burn and the waters rise and the old world end. They would have carried memories of sophistication that they could no longer replicate. Imagine being a metalworker from a coastal city, surviving by fleeing inland, but now lacking copper and tin and proper furnaces. You remember how bronze is made, but you cannot make it. You can tell your children about bronze, but they will never see it. Eventually, your grandchildren will question whether bronze really existed or whether it was a legend. The frustration would be immense. The knowledge is there in memory, but without the infrastructure and resources, it is useless. This is why oral traditions emphasize that the ancestors knew more or that knowledge was lost because it was true. The survivors did know more than they could teach, and what they taught was less than they knew, and what the next generation learned was less than what was taught. The degradation cascade is inevitable when knowledge cannot be applied and must be preserved only in memory. But some knowledge was encoded more durably. The megalithic monuments that appear across the post-deluge world might have served as memory banks. Building a structure that will last thousands of years, encoding in its proportions and alignments the essential knowledge you want to preserve. This is information storage that survives social collapse and language change. The Great Pyramid encodes pi and phi and astronomical alignments. Was this intentional encoding of mathematical and astronomical knowledge by people who knew that knowledge could be lost if not preserved in permanent form? Stonehenge and other stone circles encode astronomical alignments that allow tracking solstices and lunar cycles. Was this practical astronomy for agricultural societies, Or was it also preservation of deeper astronomical knowledge that had been passed down? The Nazca lines in Peru, the massive geoglyphs that are only visible from the air, have never been adequately explained. Could they be encoding geographical or astronomical knowledge in a form that would survive even if the culture that created them collapsed? We do not know, but the pattern exists. Cultures emerging from the post-deluge period built monuments that encoded information. And some of these monuments remain unexplained by conventional theories that assume they are purely religious or purely practical. Perhaps they were also archives, repositories of recovered knowledge stored in the only medium that could survive millennia. The survivors then are the missing link. They explain how knowledge could survive the catastrophe. They explain why the post-deluge world shows anomalies, capabilities that appear too early or too sophisticated for isolated invention. They explain why myths globally describe divine teachers and golden ages and knowledge from before. Because these myths preserve cultural memory of actual knowledge transmission from actual survivors of an actual catastrophe. Stripping away the supernatural elements, what remains is coherent. Civilization existed before the deluge. The catastrophe destroyed it. Survivors preserved fragments. These fragments influenced the development of post-deluge civilizations. The influence was not total. Most knowledge was lost, but enough survived to make the post-deluge recovery faster and more sophisticated than it would have been if humanity had truly been starting from zero. We are not descendants of primitives slowly inventing civilization. We are descendants of survivors slowly recovering civilization. And the civilization we have rebuilt over the past 10,000 years is not the first. It is the second or possibly the third or the 10th. We do not know how many times the cycle has repeated. We only know that it has repeated at least once, that the deluge destroyed what came before. The survivors carried fragments forward, and that we are living in the recovered world. Building on foundations we did not lay, using knowledge we did not originate, walking a path that has been walked before. The survivors tried to tell us through myths and monuments and carefully preserved oral traditions. But we have dismissed their testimony as primitive fantasy. And in dismissing them, we have forgotten who we are. We have forgotten that we are not the first. We are just the latest. And that distinction matters more than we realize. Because if we are not first, if the pattern has repeated before, then the pattern can repeat again. And the survivors of the next catastrophe will carry fragments of our civilization forward into whatever comes next. Unless we break the cycle, unless we learn, unless we remember what the survivors tried so hard to teach us, that civilization is fragile, that catastrophe is possible, that knowledge can be lost, that we are not immune, and that the warnings encoded by those who lived through the last vanishing are warnings meant for us. This is not an academic question. This is not a matter of historical curiosity to be debated in university seminars while the rest of the world moves on unconcerned. Whether a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished matters profoundly, urgently, existentially for us living right now. Because if such a civilization existed, if they achieved sophistication comparable to Bronze Age or beyond, if they concentrated on coastal plains and built cities and accumulated knowledge and believed themselves permanent, and if they were then destroyed so completely by fire and flood and time that 12,000 years later we debate whether they ever existed, then we are not unique. We are not pioneers. We are not the first to reach the heights we have reached. We are repeating a pattern, walking a path walked before, making the same assumptions, building in the same vulnerable locations, ignoring the same warning signs, and facing the same existential risks. The question of their existence is really a question about our future, about whether we are wise enough to learn from the vanished or arrogant enough to believe it cannot happen to us, about whether we recognize the cycle or pretend we are outside it, about whether we prepare or assume permanence and the clock is already ticking. The same mechanisms that caused them to vanish are operating now. Sea levels rising, climate changing, cosmic threats continuing, knowledge concentrated in fragile forms, populations vulnerable, and we are doing almost nothing to mitigate these risks because we do not believe we can vanish. We think we are different, special, protected by our technology and our sophistication. But they probably thought the same thing. Consider what we are building. A global civilization of extraordinary capability and equally extraordinary fragility. We have achieved things that would seem like magic to people from even 2 centuries ago. Instant communication across the planet. Flight, space travel, computers, medical technology that extends lifespans and cures diseases. Energy systems that power billions of homes and factories. Food production on industrial scale, feeding 8 billion people. This is genuine achievement. This is sophistication that required accumulating knowledge over generations and applying human intelligence and creativity at scale. But this sophistication comes with vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that are structural, built into the system, unavoidable given how we have organized ourselves. And these vulnerabilities are exactly the same vulnerabilities that would have made a pre-deluge civilization susceptible to vanishing. We are coastal. 40% of humanity lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. All of our major cities, the centers of population and economic activity and cultural production, are at or near sea level. New York, London, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, Jakarta, Miami, all vulnerable to sea level rise or storm surge. If sea levels rose rapidly, as they did at the end of the Ice Age, billions of people would be displaced, infrastructure would be destroyed, economic systems would collapse, political instability, conflict over remaining resources, cascading failures through interconnected systems, not extinction necessarily, but collapse of global civilization. Reversion to localized survival-focused communities, knowledge loss as specialists die and infrastructure fails. The same pattern. And just like the pre-deluge coastal civilizations, if they existed, our ruins would be submerged and buried and eroded and transformed until future archaeologists would have difficulty proving we existed. We are concentrated, not just geographically, but organizationally. Supply chains are global, which means efficient but also fragile. Food production depends on industrial agriculture, which depends on petroleum for fuel and fertilizer, which depends on global energy markets, which depend on political stability. One disruption cascades. Medicine depends on pharmaceutical manufacturing concentrated in a few countries. Critical minerals for electronics are mined in specific locations. If those locations become unavailable due to conflict or disaster, entire industries shut down. We have optimized for efficiency, creating systems with no redundancy, no backup, no resilience. A pre-deluge civilization would likely have been similar. Specialization and trade and concentration of resources in cities create efficiency, but also vulnerability. When the catastrophe struck, when trade routes were cut and cities were destroyed and specialists died, the entire system collapsed. We are vulnerable to the same collapse, not from external conquest, though that remains possible, but from natural catastrophe or self-inflicted crisis overwhelming our interconnected systems and cascading through the entire global network faster than we can adapt. We are dependent on fragile knowledge systems. Most of what we know exists in digital form: databases, servers, hard drives, cloud storage, all of which require electricity and functioning computers and maintenance. If the electrical grid fails for extended period, digital storage media begin failing within years. Hard drives require power to maintain magnetic charges. Solid-state drives lose charge over time without power. Servers overheat without cooling and components fail. Within a decade, without maintenance, most digital storage would be unreadable. And even if the hardware survived, the formats change. We can barely read data from 30-year-old computers because the operating systems and file formats are obsolete. Imagine trying to read digital storage from a civilization that collapsed 200 years ago. The technology would be incompatible. The knowledge would be locked in media we cannot access. This is not hypothetical. We are already experiencing digital dark age, with data from the 1980s and 90s becoming unreadable because the technology to read it no longer exists. Now extrapolate to a catastrophe that destroys infrastructure globally. How much knowledge survives? Physical books are being replaced by e-books. Libraries are closing or reducing physical collections. Academic journals are digital only. If we lose electricity permanently, we lose almost everything. Future survivors would have access to almost no technical knowledge. They would have to rediscover metallurgy, agriculture, mathematics, everything from observational experimentation, just like the post-deluge survivors apparently had to do. The threats are real and ongoing, not hypothetical future scenarios, but actual current risks that we largely ignore because assuming permanence is psychologically easier than confronting existential vulnerability. Cosmic threats remain. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs was approximately 10 kilometers in diameter. We have catalogued most near-Earth asteroids larger than 1 kilometer, and none are on collision course for the foreseeable future. But we have not catalogued all of them. New asteroids are discovered monthly, and long-period comets, coming from the outer solar system, might give only weeks or months of warning. If a Younger Dryas scale impact occurred tomorrow, fragmented comet with multiple air bursts and ground strikes, we would be as helpless as the Ice Age populations were. We have no proven asteroid deflection capability. We have theories and proposals and recent demonstration missions like DART that successfully changed an asteroid's orbit slightly, but we have never deflected a large object on short notice. If we detected a comet on collision course with 3 months warning, we could not stop it. Evacuation would be chaos. Impact would be catastrophic. Fires, climate disruption, infrastructure destruction, population collapse. The same sequence that caused the pre-deluge world to vanish. Climate change is the slow-motion catastrophe we are inflicting on ourselves. Not as dramatic as cosmic impact, but potentially as destructive over longer time scale. Global temperatures rising, ice sheets melting, sea levels beginning to rise measurably. Currently rising at about 3 millimeters per year, which sounds minimal until you extrapolate over decades and centuries. 3 millimeters per year is 30 centimeters per century, which is 1 foot. But the rate is accelerating. If major ice sheets in Greenland or West Antarctica destabilize and begin sliding into the ocean, the rate could jump to feet per decade rather than inches. Meltwater pulse 1b raise sea levels 30-50 feet in 200 to 500 years. Approximately 6 inches per decade averaged over that period, but likely faster during peak melting. We could experience similar rates if the ice sheets collapse. And unlike 12,000 years ago, we now have 8 billion people on the planet. Most coastal infrastructure concentrated exactly where flooding will occur. The displacement would be staggering. Hundreds of millions of refugees, economic collapse, political instability, conflict over remaining resources, cascading failures through interconnected systems. Not extinction necessarily, but collapse of global civilization. Reversion to localized survival-focused communities. Knowledge loss as specialists die and infrastructure fails. The same pattern. Ecosystem collapse is another slow threat. Deforestation, overfishing, pollution, habitat destruction, species extinction. We are degrading the biological systems that provide essential services. Pollination by insects, nitrogen fixation by microorganisms, oxygen production by forests and phytoplankton, carbon sequestration. These are not luxuries. These are requirements for maintaining habitable conditions. And we are damaging them systematically, assuming that technology will compensate, or that the damage is not serious, or that someone will solve it later. But ecosystems have tipping points beyond certain thresholds. They collapse suddenly rather than degrading gradually. Coral reefs dying, rainforests converting to savanna, ocean currents changing, fisheries collapsing. Each collapse removes one support from the system. Eventually, the system as a whole fails. This happened before. The megafauna extinction at the end of the Ice Age was partly from cosmic catastrophe, but also from ecosystem disruption and human overhunting. Large animals disappeared, ecosystems restructured. Humans who depended on hunting megafauna had to adapt or die. We are more dependent on functional ecosystems than Ice Age humans were because we have larger populations and more specialized diets and less resilience. If ecosystems collapse, we collapse with them. And then there are the self-inflicted catastrophes we know are possible but act as though they are not. Nuclear weapons remain, thousands of warheads, enough to destroy civilization multiple times. Launch systems on hair trigger alert. Command and control systems that assume rational actors. But history shows that accidents happen, that close calls occur, that systems fail in unexpected ways. The Cold War is over, but the weapons remain. And as more nations develop nuclear capability, the probability of use increases. A limited regional nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan, for example, would kill tens of millions directly and potentially cause global climate disruption from smoke and soot in the stratosphere. A full-scale exchange between major powers would be civilization ending. Nuclear winter, crop failures, starvation. Most of humanity dying within years, survivors scattered in regions where food production remained possible, knowledge lost as specialists die. Infrastructure destroyed beyond repair in our lifetimes, recovery taking centuries or millennia. Just like the post-deluge recovery. Engineered pandemics are the nightmare scenario that keeps biosecurity experts awake. We now have the capability to engineer pathogens. FIRA-SPR and other gene editing tools are accessible to university labs globally. Synthesizing viruses from published genetic sequences is possible. Modifying pathogens to increase transmissibility or lethality is technically feasible. Most scientists are responsible, but it only takes one bad actor or one accident. An engineered pathogen that combines high transmissibility with high lethality, released deliberately or accidentally, could spread globally within weeks. Modern transportation ensures it. International air travel means a pathogen released in one city reaches every major city in days. If mortality rate is high and no vaccine exists, population collapse is possible. Not extinction probably, but reduction to levels where civilization cannot be maintained. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe. An engineered plague could do worse globally. And in the aftermath, the same pattern. Survivors scattered, knowledge lost, infrastructure collapsing without maintenance, slow recovery over generations. The pattern is clear. We face multiple existential or civilization-threatening risks. Some natural, some self-inflicted, some sudden, some gradual, some more probable than others. But the combination means the probability of facing at least one serious catastrophe within the next century is not negligible. Climate change is already occurring. Ecosystem stress is measurable. Asteroid impacts are statistically certain over long enough time scales. Pandemics happen regularly, with COVID-19 demonstrating how quickly a novel pathogen spreads. Nuclear weapons exist and proliferate. And we are doing very little to prepare. We are not building resilience into systems. We are not preserving knowledge in durable forms. We are not decentralizing populations and infrastructure. We are not creating backup systems. We are assuming that nothing serious will happen, or that we will adapt when it does. But this is the same assumption every civilization makes. The same assumption the pre-deluge world made if it existed. And it is an assumption that catastrophe proves wrong suddenly and violently. This is why the question of pre-deluge civilization matters. Not because proving they existed changes anything about our current risks. The risks exist whether they existed or not. But because if they existed and vanished, it proves the principle. It proves that sophisticated civilizations can be destroyed. It proves that vanishing is possible. It proves that assuming permanence is delusion. It proves that the warning in myths is based on reality. And it should therefore motivate us to take those warnings seriously, to prepare to build resilience, to preserve knowledge durably, to acknowledge our vulnerability, to stop assuming we are special and immune. The myths say this happened before it can happen again. The geology says catastrophe occurred that would have destroyed coastal civilizations. The archaeology says we find anomalies suggesting knowledge from before. The probability says risk of catastrophe is real and ongoing. And we ignore all of it because acknowledging vulnerability is uncomfortable, and preparing for catastrophe is expensive, and assuming permanence is easier. So what should we do? If we take seriously the possibility that civilization can vanish, what concrete actions follow? First, preserve knowledge durably, not just digitally, but in forms that survive catastrophe. Physical books in distributed libraries. Stone monuments encoding essential principles of mathematics and astronomy. Metal plates with key information buried in geologically stable locations. Satellite archives in stable orbits. Lunar repositories where no atmosphere or water or biology exist to cause decay. Multiple redundant systems, so if one fails, others remain. Include not just technical knowledge but historical knowledge. Tell future survivors who we were, what we achieved, what destroyed us, what lessons we learned. Do not let us vanish so completely that they debate whether we existed. Second, decentralize. Reduce dependence on global supply chains by increasing local production capacity, distributed power generation rather than centralized grids, local food production rather than industrial monoculture, community-level knowledge and skills rather than specialization concentrated in institutions, resilience through redundancy. So when one system fails, others continue functioning. So when one region is devastated, others can help rebuild. So when specialists die, knowledge survives in multiple communities. This is not advocating return to primitive conditions. This is advocating for robust systems that combine modern capability with traditional resilience. Third, take threats seriously. Fund asteroid detection and deflection programs properly, climate change mitigation and adaptation infrastructure, pandemic preparedness and rapid response capabilities, nuclear weapons reduction and improved command and control systems, ecosystem protection and restoration. These are not optional luxuries. These are survival requirements. The cost of preparation is far less than the cost of catastrophe. But preparation requires acknowledging that catastrophe is possible, and we are culturally resistant to that acknowledgement because it contradicts the narrative of inevitable progress and human mastery of nature. Fourth, learn humility. Accept that we are not the first. Accept that we are not guaranteed to survive. Accept that civilization is fragile and impermanent. Accept that knowledge can be lost. Accept that we are part of a cycle not exempt from it. This does not mean fatalism or despair. This means realism. This means respecting the power of nature and time and catastrophe. This means building with the understanding that what we build might need to survive our collapse. This means encoding warnings for future generations because we might become the vanished civilization that they debate about. The pre-deluge world, if it existed, tried to warn us through myths. We have dismissed their warning. If we vanish, will we leave adequate warnings for those who come after? Or will we assume we are too sophisticated to be destroyed and leave nothing but ruins and ambiguous anomalies and myths that future archaeologists dismiss? The survivors of the pre-deluge catastrophe, if there were survivors of a pre-deluge catastrophe, tried desperately to preserve what they could, to pass fragments forward, to encode knowledge in myths and monuments, to teach the next generation that civilization is impermanent and catastrophe is real. And we have ignored them for generations, treating their testimony as primitive fantasy. But the testimony is consistent, global, detailed, and it matches what geology tells us happened. Maybe it is time we listen. Not because we can prove they existed, but because the warning is valid whether they existed or not. Catastrophe is possible. Vanishing is possible. We could be next. And the only way to break the cycle is to acknowledge we are in the cycle. To prepare instead of assume, to preserve instead of concentrate, to learn humility instead of maintain arrogance. The vanished civilization, if it existed, cannot speak directly. But their legacy speaks through myths, through anomalies, through warnings encoded across cultures. And the message is clear: learn from us. We were sophisticated, we were confident, we assumed permanence, we were wrong. Do better than we did. Prepare for what we did not prepare for. Survive what we did not survive. Remember us and do not repeat our fate. This is why their existence matters. Not as historical curiosity, but as present warning, not as past mystery, but as future prophecy. We are walking the same path. The question is whether we walk it consciously with eyes open to the risks, preparing for the catastrophes we hope will not come, but know are possible, or whether we walk it blindly assuming safety until catastrophe strikes, and we join them in vanishing. The choice is ours. But the clock is ticking and the waters are rising. If civilization can vanish, if the pattern has repeated before, if we are walking the same path that leads to the same catastrophic end, then the question becomes urgent and practical. What should we do? Not in abstract philosophical sense, but in concrete actionable terms. What specific steps can we take right now to break the cycle? To avoid becoming the next civilization that vanishes beneath rising waters and time's relentless erosion? The answer begins with acknowledging that the threat is real. This might seem obvious, but it is the hardest step, because it requires abandoning the comforting assumption that we are special, that we are different, that our technology will protect us, that catastrophe happens to other people in other times but not to us. The pre-deluge world, if it existed, made the same assumption, and they vanished. So the first action is psychological. Accept vulnerability. Accept that what we build is temporary. Accept that knowledge can be lost. Accept that sophistication provides no immunity to natural catastrophe or self-inflicted destruction. This is not pessimism. This is realism. And from that realistic foundation, we can build actual resilience instead of false confidence. The first concrete action is preserving knowledge in durable forms that survive civilizational collapse. Right now, most of our knowledge exists digitally. This is efficient for access and distribution, but catastrophically vulnerable to disruption. If global electrical infrastructure fails for any extended period, digital storage begins dying. Hard drives fail, servers crash, data becomes unreadable. Within a generation, the vast majority of our accumulated knowledge would be inaccessible, even if the physical storage media survived, because the technology to read it would be gone. We need redundant preservation systems. Physical books printed on acid-free paper stored in distributed libraries in geologically stable regions. Not just major cities which are vulnerable to the same coastal flooding that destroyed the Ice Age settlements, but interior highland locations that would survive sea level rise. Libraries should be designed not just for current use but for survival. Fireproof, waterproof, temperature-controlled, with physical security and institutional commitment to preservation across generations. Stone monuments encoding essential knowledge, not decorative statues, but functional information storage. Mathematical constants like pi and phi. Astronomical data including precession rates and planetary orbits. Basic principles of metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, engineering. Encoded in durable materials using symbols and diagrams that can be understood without requiring knowledge of our specific languages. This is what the survivors of the pre-deluge catastrophe might have attempted with megalithic monuments. We should learn from them and do it deliberately. Metal plates with critical information etched in corrosion-resistant alloys like titanium or gold, buried in multiple locations with clear surface markers indicating their presence. Include instructions for rediscovering lost technologies. Include warnings about known catastrophic risks. Include historical records so future civilizations understand what happened to us. Satellite archives placing information storage in stable orbits beyond Earth's atmosphere. Radiation-hardened storage media containing compressed versions of our libraries, our histories, our technical knowledge. Designed to be retrievable by future civilizations that reach orbital capability, even if separated from us by thousands of years. Lunar repositories where no atmosphere or water or biological decay exists. The Moon is geologically dead, which makes it perfect for long-term storage. Information encoded on metal plates or ceramic tablets buried in lunar regolith would survive millions of years unchanged. This might sound like science fiction, but the technology exists now. We could begin building these preservation systems today if we had the will and the funding. The cost would be tiny compared to military budgets or corporate profits. But we do not do it because we do not believe we need it. We assume our civilization is permanent. The second concrete action is decentralizing our systems to increase resilience. Current global civilization is optimized for efficiency through centralization and specialization. This creates vulnerability. Supply chains span continents. Manufacturing is concentrated in specific regions. Critical infrastructure like power generation and data centers and pharmaceutical production exists in centralized facilities. When disruption occurs, it cascades through the entire system. We need deliberate decentralization. Local food production capability so communities can feed themselves if global supply chains fail. Community gardens, local farms. Distributed agricultural knowledge, seed banks maintained at community level. Local manufacturing capability. Not full industrial production, but basic workshops with tools and knowledge to make and repair essential items. This used to be standard. Every town had blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers. We have lost this distributed capability in favor of centralized factories. Distributed power generation, solar panels on individual buildings, small-scale wind turbines, microhydro where water resources exist, battery storage at community level, grid-tied when the grid exists, but capable of operating independently when it does not. Distributed knowledge, not just centralized universities and research institutions, but community-level education in practical skills. Metalworking, agriculture, construction, medicine, passed down through apprenticeship and hands-on training, so knowledge exists in multiple redundant locations. This does not mean abandoning modern technology or global cooperation. This means creating backup systems, so when centralized systems fail, local systems can continue functioning. Resilience through redundancy. The third concrete action is taking existential threats seriously and funding adequate preparation and mitigation. We know what the major threats are. We have identified them. But we are not responding proportionally to their severity. Asteroid detection and deflection. We have made progress. The DART mission demonstrated that we can change an asteroid's orbit. But we need comprehensive detection systems to identify threats early and proven deflection capabilities that can be deployed on short notice. This requires sustained funding and international cooperation. It requires treating space-based threats as seriously as we treat terrestrial military threats. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs would end human civilization if it hit today. We should be spending billions annually to ensure we can prevent this. Climate change mitigation and adaptation. The science is clear. The consequences are measurable. We need aggressive transition to non-carbon energy sources. We need carbon capture and sequestration. We need coastal infrastructure designed for sea level rise. We need planned relocation strategies for populations in vulnerable areas. We need agricultural systems adapted to changing climate. We need ecosystem restoration to maintain biological services we depend on. This is not optional. This is survival. And it requires political will to prioritize long-term survival over short-term economic interests. Pandemic preparedness. COVID-19 demonstrated both that pandemics can disrupt global civilization and that our response systems are inadequate. We need better early detection, faster vaccine development, distributed manufacturing capacity for medical supplies, protocols for rapid response that balance public health with economic and social stability. We need biocontainment measures to prevent accidental or deliberate release of engineered pathogens. We need international cooperation on biosecurity standards, nuclear weapons reduction, and improved command and control. The Cold War is over, but thousands of nuclear warheads remain. We need continued arms reduction treaties. We need improved safeguards against accidental launch. We need recognition that nuclear war would end civilization and that preventing it requires active ongoing effort. Ecosystem protection and restoration. We need to stop treating nature as infinite resource to exploit. We need protected wilderness areas. We need restoration of degraded ecosystems. We need sustainable harvesting of resources we continue to use. We need recognition that healthy ecosystems provide services we cannot replicate artificially at any cost. Protecting them is protecting ourselves. All of this requires resources, political will, international cooperation, and long-term thinking. It requires acknowledging that the threats are real and that prevention is cheaper than response. The fourth concrete action is learning humility. This is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. We must accept that we are not special. We are not guaranteed to survive. We are not immune to catastrophe. We are part of a pattern that has played out before and can play out again. This means building with the understanding that what we build might not last. Encoding knowledge for future rediscovery. Creating monuments that serve not just our current needs, but the needs of survivors who might come after us. This means treating myths and warnings from previous ages with respect rather than dismissal. The flood myths are consistent across cultures. The references to lost knowledge appear in multiple traditions. The megalithic monuments encode information we do not fully understand. Maybe they are trying to tell us something. Maybe the survivors of the last catastrophe left warnings. Maybe we should listen. This means approaching our own civilization's trajectory with appropriate caution. We are building in the same vulnerable coastal locations. We are concentrating populations and resources. We are creating centralized systems with no backup. We are assuming permanence. All the same patterns that would have made the pre-deluge civilization vulnerable. We should learn from their apparent mistakes instead of repeating them. Humility means acknowledging that 12,000 years from now, if a civilization exists, they might be doing archaeology on our ruins and debating whether we were sophisticated or primitive. They might find our plastic and our concrete and our strange alloys and argue about whether these indicate advanced technology or just natural processes. They might read our surviving texts and dismiss them as mythology because the capabilities we describe seem impossible. They might stand on land that is now ocean or ocean that is now land and never find our cities because they are looking in the wrong places. We should prepare for this possibility. We should leave clear, unambiguous evidence that we existed. We should encode warnings about what destroyed us. We should preserve knowledge in forms they can find and understand. Not because we are certain to fail, but because acknowledging the possibility of failure is the first step toward preventing it. These four actions, preserve, decentralize, prepare, and learn humility, are not exhaustive. They are starting points. They are the minimum we should be doing right now if we take seriously the possibility that civilization can vanish. The pre-deluge world, if it existed, did not do these things. Or if they did not do them well enough, and they vanished. We have the advantage of potentially learning from their failure. We have the advantage of knowing the pattern exists. The question is whether we will use that knowledge. Whether we will act while there is still time. Whether we will prepare before catastrophe forces us to react. Whether we will be the generation that breaks the cycle or just another turn of the wheel. The choice is ours. But time is not infinite. The threats are already present. Climate is changing, ecosystems are degrading, nuclear weapons exist, asteroids orbit, pandemics emerge. We can respond proactively with preparation and resilience, or we can respond reactively after catastrophe with desperation and loss. One path leads to survival, the other leads to vanishing. The survivors of the pre-deluge world, if they existed, chose to preserve what they could. They built monuments, they passed down myths, they taught their children the old knowledge. Their efforts were not sufficient to prevent the loss of their civilization, but they were sufficient to pass fragments forward. We can do better. We have more knowledge, more technology, more resources. We have the capacity to build true resilience, to preserve comprehensively, to prepare adequately. Whether we will actually do it depends on whether we learn the lesson the vanished are trying to teach us. That permanence is illusion, that catastrophe is possible, that preparation is necessary, that humility is wisdom. The warnings are all around us. In the myths, in the geology, in the pattern of risk, in the silence of the ocean floor. The question is whether we listen. We have traveled a long journey together through deep time and catastrophe, and the uncomfortable possibility that everything we thought we knew about human history might be incomplete. We have examined the evidence for vanishing, the mechanisms that could remove civilization, so completely that 12,000 years later we debate whether it existed. We have reconstructed what such a civilization might have been like, where they would have built, what technologies they might have mastered. We have traced the fragments they left behind in myths and monuments and anomalies that appear too sophisticated for their supposed time. We have understood how catastrophe caused them to vanish through fire and flood and geological transformation. We have recognized the survivors who carried knowledge forward and influenced the civilizations that emerged afterward. And we have confronted why this matters urgently for us. Why the question is not academic but existential. Now we arrive at the final question, the one that each person must answer for themselves. What do we believe? Can we prove definitively that a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished? And if we cannot prove it, how do we live with that uncertainty? How do we respond to warnings that might be based on reality or might be mythological fantasy? How do we balance skepticism with openness, rationality with intuition, the paradigm with the anomalies? This is not a question with simple answer. This is the question of how we approach truth when evidence is incomplete and conclusions are unavoidable but unprovable. And the answer matters because how we answer determines whether we learn from the past or ignore it, whether we prepare for the future or assume safety, whether we are humble enough to acknowledge we might not be first or arrogant enough to believe we are special. Let us be honest about what can and cannot be proven. We cannot prove definitively that a lost civilization existed 12,000 years ago. We do not have intact cities to excavate. We do not have written records from that period. We do not have datable artifacts definitively showing sophisticated technology before the conventional timeline. What we have is circumstantial evidence. Strong circumstantial evidence in some cases, ambiguous evidence in others, but nothing that rises to the level of proof that would convince a determined skeptic. The geological catastrophe is proven. Younger Dryas climate reversal is proven. Sea level rise of 400 feet is proven. Continental scale fires indicated by the black mat layer are proven. Cosmic impact markers are documented though still debated. Human population bottleneck is shown in genetic data. Megafauna extinction is proven. These are facts. But whether these catastrophes destroyed a lost human civilization that requires interpretation. It is possible that they destroyed only scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. It is possible that coastal populations existed but were not particularly sophisticated. It is possible that the myths are just myths, independent inventions by cultures processing local flood experiences. These alternatives are possible. We cannot rule them out absolutely. The global flood myths are documented. 200 cultures with remarkably similar narratives, but myths can be explained in multiple ways. Maybe they are cultural memories of actual catastrophe, which is my interpretation. Or maybe they are independent inventions, coincidentally similar. which is the conventional interpretation. Or maybe they spread through cultural contact, one origin point with later borrowing, which is another possibility. We cannot prove which interpretation is correct. The myths exist. The similarities are striking, but proving they derive from shared memory of specific catastrophe requires assumptions about transmission and preservation that cannot be verified directly. Göbekli Tepe and other megalithic sites are anomalies. They show capability appearing earlier than expected. But anomalies can be explained as exceptional developments, lucky combinations of circumstances without requiring pre-existing knowledge inheritance. The sudden appearance of agriculture and metallurgy and writing can be explained as rapid independent development rather than recovery of earlier knowledge. Plausible arguments exist on both sides. We cannot definitively prove which interpretation is correct. The absence of definitive evidence from the continental shelves is absence, not proof. We have not searched comprehensively. But not finding evidence where we have not looked does not prove evidence exists where we have not looked. It leaves open the possibility, but it does not confirm it. If we conducted systematic, comprehensive underwater archaeology of all likely areas and found nothing definitive, that would be evidence of absence. But we have not done this, so we remain in evidential limbo. Enough suggestion to take the possibility seriously, not enough proof to declare it certain. This is uncomfortable. Humans prefer certainty. We prefer questions with clear answers. But this question does not have clear answer. It has probability distributions. And different people evaluating the same evidence will reach different probability assessments based on their prior assumptions, and their standards for evidence, and their tolerance for uncertainty. My assessment, for what it is worth, is that the probability of some form of pre-deluge lost civilization existing is moderate to high, perhaps 50 to 70% probability, not certain, not proven, but more likely than not. When I weigh all the evidence, the catastrophe is proven. The geography is proven. Coasts were where people would live and coasts are now submerged. The myths are too consistent across too many cultures to be completely coincidental. The anomalies in post-deluge archaeology are suggestive. The pattern of knowledge appearing fully formed rather than developing gradually is interesting. The survivor's narrative explains multiple features of the post-deluge world more parsimoniously than the conventional timeline. But I acknowledge uncertainty. 30 to 50% probability that the conventional timeline is essentially correct. That humans were primitive until agriculture developed. That myths are just myths. That anomalies are just anomalies. That we are the first sophisticated civilization. I cannot rule this out. The evidence is insufficient for certainty, and different people will reach different probability assessments, and that is acceptable. Uncertainty is honest position when evidence is incomplete. But here is what matters more than the probability assessment. The warning is valid regardless. Whether or not pre-deluge civilization existed, the catastrophe definitely occurred. The Younger Dryas happened. Sea levels rose 400 feet. Climate changed catastrophically. Populations collapsed. This is proven, and it means catastrophe at civilization-threatening scale is possible. It happened 12,000 years ago. It could happen again. Cosmic impacts remain a threat. Climate change is occurring now. Ecosystem collapse is measurable. Nuclear weapons exist. Pandemics emerge regularly. The specific risks vary, but the general principle is constant. We are vulnerable. Civilization is fragile. Vanishing is possible. And if a previous civilization tried to warn us about this through myths and monuments, and we dismissed their warning because we cannot prove they existed, we are being foolish. The warning is valid whether they existed or not. Prepare for catastrophe. Preserve knowledge durably. Build resilience. Do not assume permanence. These are sensible precautions regardless of historical interpretation. So while the academic question of whether pre-deluge civilization existed remains open, the practical question of how we should respond is answered. We should act as if the warning is real, because even if it is not based on historical precedent, it is based on geological and logical reality. Catastrophe is possible. We should prepare. There is also the question of why mainstream academia resists this possibility so strongly. And the answer is not conspiracy or deliberate suppression. The answer is conservatism, which is appropriate in science combined with paradigm inertia, which is less appropriate but is human nature. Science advances by incremental modification of accepted models. Revolutionary overhauls of fundamental assumptions are rare and face enormous resistance because the entire field is built on those assumptions. Changing them means rewriting textbooks, reinterpreting existing data, admitting that previous work was based on incorrect framework. This is professionally costly. Researchers who challenge paradigms risk their careers. Funding goes to conventional research. Publications favor incremental findings over revolutionary claims. This system protects against premature acceptance of incorrect ideas, which is good. But it also prevents investigation of potentially correct ideas that challenge the paradigm, which is bad. The result is that questions like pre-deluge civilization do not get serious research attention, not because they have been investigated and disproven, but because they are assumed to be wrong, so they are not investigated. This is not how science is supposed to work, but it is how science often works in practice. The paradigm says civilization began with agriculture around 10,000 BC and urbanization around 500 BC. Anything suggesting earlier civilization contradicts this paradigm, and contradictory evidence is scrutinized more harshly than supporting evidence. Anomalies like Göbekli Tepe are explained as exceptions rather than as evidence the paradigm is wrong. Myths are dismissed as unreliable. Underwater anomalies are interpreted as natural formations unless proven otherwise. Probability assessments favor conventional interpretation. This is not dishonest. This is how paradigms function. They filter evidence. They determine what questions are worth asking. They shape interpretation, and they resist change until the accumulation of anomalies becomes overwhelming and paradigm shift becomes unavoidable. We are not at that point yet. The anomalies exist, but they are not yet overwhelming. So the paradigm persists and will persist until either definitive evidence is found that cannot be explained away, or until generational shift brings new researchers who are more open to alternative interpretations. This will happen eventually. The question is whether it happens through discovery or through slow cultural change, and whether it happens soon enough to influence how we prepare for our own potential catastrophe. Living with uncertainty is difficult but necessary. We want answers. We want to know definitively whether pre-deluge civilization existed. But we do not have, and may never have, definitive answer. The evidence that would prove it vanished in the catastrophe we are asking about. The continental shelves have not been searched comprehensively and may never be, because the cost is prohibitive and the expected probability of success is low given the vanishing mechanisms. So we must make peace with not knowing for certain. We must act on probabilities rather than certainties. We must acknowledge that some questions remain open, not because we are ignorant, but because the universe has not provided sufficient evidence for definitive answer. This is mature epistemological position. This is intellectual humility. This is accepting that reality is complex and evidence is limited and absolute certainty is rare, and it is the position we must adopt regarding pre-deluge civilization. Possible, probable even, but not proven, and that is acceptable. What is not acceptable is dismissing the question entirely, saying we have no proof, therefore they definitely did not exist, is as dogmatic as saying they definitely existed. The honest position is we do not know, but the evidence suggests it is possible, and the question deserves serious investigation. And the honest approach is to remain open to evidence while maintaining skepticism about unsupported claims. When underwater structures are found, investigate them properly before dismissing them as natural. When myths show striking consistency, Analyze them seriously rather than assuming they are fictional. When anomalies appear in the archaeological record, consider alternative explanations rather than forcing them into conventional timeline. This is not advocating for credulity. This is advocating for genuine open-minded skepticism rather than paradigm-defending dismissal. The difference matters. Open-minded skepticism says, "Show me convincing evidence and I will update my beliefs." Paradigm-defending dismissal says no evidence would convince me because the paradigm says it is impossible. Science should be the former. Too often it is the latter. The myths themselves deserve more respect than we have given them. For thousands of years, hundreds of cultures preserved these stories. The deluge, the catastrophe, the survivors, the knowledge from before, the rebuilding. Generation after generation told these stories to their children. Considered them important enough to maintain despite having no written records for most of that time, despite cultural changes and language shifts and geographical dispersal. Why? If they are just entertaining fiction, why the consistency? Why the effort to preserve across hundreds of generations? The simpler explanation is that they are based on something real, compressed, distorted, mythologized over time, yes, but based on actual events, actual catastrophe, actual cultural memory. Dismissing them as primitive fantasy is arrogant. It assumes we are smarter than our ancestors, that we understand their history better than they did, that we can determine from fragmentary archaeology what they could not determine from cultural memory. Maybe we should be more humble. Maybe they knew something we do not. Maybe their insistence that the stories are true, that catastrophe happened, that worlds existed before ours. Maybe that insistence is based on actual transmitted knowledge rather than invention. Standing here at the end of this investigation, looking back across 12,000 years of deep time, across 400 feet of risen ocean, across the ruins that might or might not be buried beneath the continental shelves, we must ask ourselves what we believe. Not what we can prove, not what the paradigm allows, but what we actually believe. When we look at all the evidence together, the catastrophe proven by geology, the myths consistent across cultures, the anomalies in archaeology, the survivor's narrative explaining post-deluge developments, the warnings encoded in monuments, the patterns suggesting we are not first. What does it all mean? What is more likely? That humans remained primitive for 300,000 years and then suddenly invented civilization 10,000 years ago, or that civilization arose multiple times, vanished by catastrophe, recovered through survivors, arose again? Which narrative better explains the totality of evidence? Which narrative is simpler? Which requires fewer unsupported assumptions? For me, the answer is clear. I believe a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge. I believe they concentrated on coastal plains now submerged. I believe they achieved Bronze Age, or possibly greater sophistication. I believe they vanished by the Younger Dryas catastrophe. I believe survivors preserved fragments of knowledge. I believe those fragments influenced post-deluge civilizations. I believe the myths are based on cultural memory of actual events. I believe we are not the first. I believe the cycle has repeated before. And I believe the warnings are real. This is belief, not proof. This is probability assessment, not certainty. But it is informed belief based on careful examination of available evidence and consideration of alternative explanations. And it is belief that matters for how I live. Because if I am right, then we are vulnerable in the same ways they were vulnerable. We face similar risks and we need to prepare. But even if I am wrong, even if the conventional timeline is correct and no lost pre-deluge civilization existed, the practical implications remain the same. Catastrophe is possible, we should prepare. Knowledge should be preserved durably. Resilience should be built into systems. Humility should replace arrogance. These conclusions follow whether or not the pre-deluge world was sophisticated. They follow from the proven fact of past catastrophe and the logical certainty of future risk. So, in that sense, the historical question, while fascinating, is less important than the forward-looking question. What are we going to do? Are we going to take the warnings seriously? Are we going to prepare? Are we going to preserve? Are we going to build with the understanding that what we build might need to survive our collapse? Or are we going to assume permanence, assume safety, assume we are special, and repeat the pattern? The silence of the ocean floor remains 400 feet below the surface, covered by sediment transformed by time. The evidence that would answer definitively might still exist or might not. We do not know because we have not looked. But the silence itself speaks. It tells us that vanishing is real, that civilizations can disappear. That absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, when the evidence would be exactly where we are not searching. And it asks us to remember, to honor those who might have come before, to learn from their vanishing if they vanished, to avoid their fate if we can, to break the cycle by acknowledging it exists, to be the generation that survives rather than the generation that vanishes and is forgotten and is debated about by distant descendants who wonder if we were real. What if a lost civilization existed before the Ancient Deluge and vanished? The question remains open. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The probability is moderate but not certain. The debate continues, but the warning echoes forward through time regardless. From the myths, from the monuments, from the geological record of catastrophe, from the pattern of rise and fall and vanishing and recovery, the warning says this has happened before. It can happen again. Prepare, preserve, remember. Do not assume permanence. Do not believe you are immune. Do not ignore the signs. We are not special, we are not exempt. We are just the latest, and whether we survive to become something more than the latest depends on whether we listen to the warning or dismiss it, whether we learn from the vanished or join them, whether we break the cycle or continue it. The choice is ours, but the ocean keeps its secrets. The myths keep speaking, the warnings keep echoing, and 12,000 years from now, if a civilization exists, they might stand on land that is now ocean or ocean that is now land and ask the same question about us. Did they exist? Were they sophisticated? What happened to them? And the answer they find depends on what we do now, on what we preserve, on whether we are wise enough to encode warnings for them the way warnings were encoded for us, on whether we survive or vanish, on whether we remember or forget. The question of the pre-deluge world is really a question about us, about who we are, about whether we will learn, about whether we will remember what has been forgotten, about whether we will heed the warning from the deep time and the deep water, about whether we are the generation that finally breaks the cycle or just another turn of the wheel. The answer is not yet written. The story is not yet finished. The silence of the vanished is speaking, and we must decide whether to listen.